Hello, hello.
Good morning.
Good morning. Can you hear
How you
me, Allie?
doing? Yep, can hear you loud and clear.
Oh, excellent. Good morning. How you doing?
Good, how are you?
Good. The day is finally here, huh?
And it's here, yeah. It's showtime.
Showtime.
Yes,
Excellent. How many people are
I'll just run through kind of like the welcome spiel and logistics and all that good stuff.
Sure.
And then one other person's going to talk. He'll hand it back to me, and then I'll do your introduction, and then I'll hand it off to you.
Fantastic. How many people you have joining you this morning?
I think there's like 425 people registered for the event, so we'll see. I don't know if they're all showing up today, but a good hand. Yeah.
Great. Well, I'm really looking forward to this. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, we're excited you're here, Obi.
Oh, good. Something a bit different, I suppose, than the rest of your proposed curriculum.
Yeah, that's good though.
Yeah.
Shaking it up a little bit, you know?
Absolutely. It's all a giant network somehow.
Yep.
The interconnectedness of everything has never been so acute.
Yes, absolutely. All right, it's 9, so I'm gonna get rolling here. All right, good morning, everybody, and welcome. My name is Allie Dunn. I'm a senior environmental scientist with the California Water Boards, and I'm unit chief of the Surface Water Ambient Monitoring Program, or SWAMP. I'm super excited to kick things off for this 27th annual CABW, or California Aquatic Bioassessment Workgroup meeting, and the 8th annual California Chapter Society for Freshwater Science meeting. So before we really get rolling into the day's agenda, I wanted to start by thanking our planning team and all of the volunteers for their awesome work organizing this event and making it happen. First, a huge thank you to Shuka Rastigarpour. I think a few of you have worked with her and received emails from her, but she's just been awesome with her leadership and coordinating all the different pieces and players involved, especially in this weird time of remote work and trying to adjust to that. So thanks, Shuka. And then I'd also want to extend a thanks to all the folks at CalSFS, Angela and Ryan and John and Christine and Rafi and Nick for your hard work and support and all of your contributions to this event. There's some really great events planned in the afternoon, which John Olson will talk about in just a second. I'll hand it off. And then finally, thanks to all of you, the participants, the presenters, for joining us today, and also just being flexible as we make this pivot into this virtual conference for the first time. So thanks. I think everybody's pretty aware of the purpose of CABW, but just to kind of reiterate, we are primarily focused on getting out there and sharing current freshwater science research and management info. It's also really about networking and building partnerships. So usually we're together face-to-face at UC Davis, and part of the fun is going out to happy hours and seeing each other and really getting our network going. This year we've set up a Slack platform, which some of you, hopefully you've signed up for. I'll talk about that in a second. But that's really our interactive way of networking and building partnerships. So please check that out. And then finally, the kind of last prong of our purpose is supporting science-based policy and natural resource management for both the protection and restoration of California's freshwater aquatic ecosystems. And we're doing all of that from our computers this year. Okay, Shuka, will you go to the next slide too? So we are completely virtual this year. So for the first time in the last, 27 years of CABW, we're entering new territory as we are completely virtual this year. Please be patient with us if we run into any technical issues, and we'll do our best to address those issues as they come up as quickly as possible, but fingers crossed, nothing does arise. We'll be using Slack, so you can engage and ask questions during and after the presentations. And if you haven't already signed up for Slack, please head over to the Slack guide or FAQ, which Shuka had shared with you all yesterday afternoon. And finally, just want to reiterate, super thankful for you all for working with us through these remote times. So for today, we have lined up, I'm going to hand off the baton here in a second to John Olson with CalSFS to do his welcome spiel for CalSFS and talk about afternoon activities. And then I will introduce Obi Kaufman for the keynote speech, which we're super excited to have Obi here. And then we have, again, silver lining. So we were able to get a panel of folks from the UK for our first session, which we're very excited and thrilled to have those guys here. We'll take a little break, come back for another set of talks, and then from there, we'll hand it off to CalSFS for the afternoon events. And with that, John, I'm going to hand it off to you.
Sally.
Hi.
Shuka, do you have my slides? Thank you. So on behalf of Nick Macias, the chapter president, and myself, I want to welcome you to it's also part of our annual meeting for the California chapter for the Society of Freshwater Science. Next slide, please, Shuka. So in uncertain times like these, I find it is helpful to basically take a step back and remember what one's purpose is, trying to stay focused on those things that are actually important to your organization. And the two things that we really want to focus on within the California chapter for SFS is promoting and understanding of aquatic ecosystems here in California and fostering this exchange of scientific information, both among ourselves as well as moving, trying to communicate with the next generation of freshwater scientists. Next slide, please, Shuka. So, this year, obviously, we've had lots of stresses on our system. However, I think we've proven ourselves resilient, and with that, the fact that we are able to help organize this meeting as well as produce the workshop that's going to happen this afternoon, as well as continue to do student awards and basically motivate students to be part of the freshwater science going forward. This has happened not through any one person's work, but by the work of many people. Nick and I, myself, have been very stressed this last year and have been completely overwhelmed by both life as well as trying to get the stuff done for SFS. And the slack has definitely been picked up by many people that you'll see today, including Ryan and Christine, who are running the workshop, as well as Angela, who will be becoming our next president, we'll talk about later. Through the hard work of all these people that stood up is the reason why this we've been able to continue in spite of the challenges of this year. And we're hopefully going to have some great posters. We got at least 8 posters. I encourage you to come and look at the poster session this afternoon after lunch. And during lunch, we're going to be doing our business meeting. So we encourage you, if you want to attend the business meeting and find out what our plans are for next year or influence those plans, you're certainly welcome to show up. Also encourage you to join CalSFS, which can be done when you join the Society for Freshwater Science. There's a little checkbox to basically add on that at the end. As we mentioned, we're going to be doing our student posters. You can go back one, Shuka. We'll do our student posters this afternoon. Encourage you to come by and look at the posters and talk with the actual poster presenters between 1:15 and 2:15 this afternoon. And after that, we'll be doing our workshop. Workshop currently is essentially full, so we won't be pushing it, but we'll put a pitch in for next year's workshop. Be sure you can come next year. We'll have another good workshop next year, I'm sure. And one more slide, Shuka. And again, encourage you to join CalSFS. It gives you a platform both to engage in freshwater science and help support students who will help you do your work in the future. And with that, I'll throw it back to Allie.
Awesome, thank you, John. So at this point, I'm very honored to introduce our keynote speaker, Obi Kaufman. For those that aren't aware of Obi's work, he's the best-selling author of the California Field Atlas and the State of Water, which for me just have been pretty magical in the way that Obi is able to articulate all of the intricacies and interconnectedness of California. He's a poet, a painter, and a naturalist. And I truly say this with all honesty, is the way that he's able to articulate that magic of California's network of living systems is truly unmatched. So today we're excited to have Obi here bringing a unique perspective to California conservation. And he does this through his data-driven art and illustration, and is a modern-day conservation hero for our special and unique, beautiful state of California. So with that, I'm thrilled to turn it over to you, Obi, for your keynote speech. Thanks.
Hello, 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 hello,
Hi.
hello. Can you hear me? Can you see me?
I can see you, hear you loud and clear.
Okay, very good. Okay, yes, there I am. Good morning, good morning. Yes, it is my pleasure, it's my honor to help kick off this event, which is, as I understand it, two things. The 27th annual meeting of the California Aquatic Bioassessment Workgroup, and the 8th annual meeting of the California chapter of the Society of Freshwater Sciences. Whatever you all call yourselves, I know you today as heroes. This methodological predisposition, the energetic stubbornness required for one to be on the path, forever searching to uncover scientific truth, is, for one, engaging with and utilizing an investigative procedure that amounts to the greatest tool humanity has ever devised. Then to couple that tool with the stewardship, always on the basis of hard data, is the best and perhaps only road through the bottleneck of ecological stress that we have already entered. Shuka, can you give me my slide there? You got my presentation? Oh yeah, okay, so there's my first image there. It's the kind of work that I make. So this bottleneck, this quickening emergency influenced by a growing and compounded network of factors from across the biosphere and its relationship to California's waterscape is the subject of my keynote today. All righty, Shuka, next slide, please. All right, as I speak this morning, the August complex fire, which continues to scorch 5 counties across Northern California and has been burning for nearly 2 months and is 76% contained, is moved to the #1 slot 1 week ago to become California's largest fire in the past 170 years that we've been keeping records. At over 1 million acres burned, this fire heralds what we dread might be a new era, one defined by the coming of the gigafire. There's a new vocabulary word for you. And as we reel from the trauma revealed by the metric that over 1/3 of California's total area that has burned within the last 100 years has burned in the last 90 days. We wonder if we can rise to the opportunity that this tragic and yet predictable challenge represents. And that opportunity is the transformational power of reset in woodland ecology and human ecology, and the critically important liminal space between the two. Alrighty, next slide there, Shuka. Okay, I'm not a scientist. I can't join you in this particular modality that you all have, apart from my own manner of citizen science. I'm working on my own path, big sprawling books on nature that describe the consilience of knowledge between the truth that the physical sciences reveal and the meaning they might imply as expressed through the human lens of art. Itself on a spectrum between analytic cartography applied to imaginative ends, all the while data-driven, referenced, and cited from the kind of work you are all up to. So here we have a map of the 3 forks of the Yuba River, a branch of blue lines representing a water course that began to flow and cut its way down the western slope of the Sierra Nevada mountains in the middle of the late Miocene, 6 to 8 million years ago, when California first really began to resemble its current tectonic configuration. And at the right, we have a map that represents California that far in the future, when the peninsula of Baja has become the island of Baja and has been escorted north by the San Andreas conveyor to become a suburb of what will ultimately be the San Francisco archipelago. In that time field reference, that the biosphere, recovering from the sixth mass extinction, will be dreaming new life forms into existence. Will placental mammals continue their terrestrial dominance, as from one perspective they do today? Who is to say? All right, next slide there. So to shore up our conceptual timeshed a little bit, we can consider the scope of our immediate human history. The decisions we've made and continue to make in the service of storing, conveying, and utilizing the substantive resource that governs all life on Earth, fresh water, and its presence or lack thereof in California. Over the past century, what we've done with water in California, being for many metrices the single most altered aspect of our natural landscape, rivals in scale and ambition and in transformative power anything human beings have ever done with anything, anywhere, at any time. It is a wholesale transformation that, alas, will only be rivaled by how we again transform it over the next century. In the next 100 years, we understand that a new bevy of challenges will bear down upon us at a scale that cannot be parsed by a single individual mind, but must be addressed by everyone. And by everyone, I mean everyone. As we speed towards the 22nd century, turning to the functional support of natural resource distribution and stewardship will be the single most elemental driver of all industry in California and beyond. Next slide, please. So I make books with hundreds of maps describing how nature works around California's floristic province. My vocation is the investigation of mind within California's ecosystems. I am trained in philosophy as much as I am trained as a painter, and I use these tools as a rake to push our societal understanding towards the sciences. Science is a big enough basket to hold all philosophy eventually. And as we are busy building hypotheses to be the frameworks for tomorrow's experiments that we have yet to be thought of, we realize that what we don't know about ecology dwarfs what we do, making it then the most wonderful and the most important time in the history of natural science to take on this subject matter. Never have we had such tools, such technology, and such networked communication to get the word out about the important discoveries you all are making every day. Next slide, please. It is hard to see through the miasma of divisiveness that pervades popular culture right now. How can we have a conversation of ethics when we are all hung up with so many agendas? Agendas often, however, unwittingly sold from so many corporate entities whose profits are determined by our disunity. That is the work that I've got to do. I'm in the business of storytelling, not argument making. Nobody's mind was ever changed about their worldview from a better argument, perhaps counterintuitively. Mine's only changed from a better story. What I need from you the world of research science is always and will forever be the best possible data. The data is the alpha and the omega of the story that I am telling. We can't talk about rights and responsibilities without it. We can't talk about the future without it. Next slide, please. So much of the miracle we live with right now is on your shoulders. Water science unlocks the door towards California's future, not only in regard to our own continued residency in this perilous and beautiful place, but to its grand legacy of world-class biodiversity. I call it a miracle because that's how I see it. Despite the overwhelming successful veneer of modern society that we've imposed on this landscape since the gold rush, where now every one of our natural landscape types is either threatened or endangered, we have a very low extinction rate. California's extinction rate is less than 1%. While it is very difficult and perhaps dangerous to declare a species extinct, and be warned that I am not saying that there are any laurels to rest on. I am saying that this fact means that there is still time. And if there is still time, there is hope. Next slide, please. The decisions that we make over the next 2 decades will influence how life looks on planet Earth for at least the next several centuries. We are all passing through a bottleneck right now where the cascading effects of feedback loops, all spawned by human intention, operate inside a dancing landscape of complex variables. The outcome of these predictive models will result in the emergence of one of 2 phenomena: catastrophic failure or catastrophic success. It is my contention that by recognizing on a societal level that the intrinsic value of biodiversity outweighs the capital value of its dismantlement, we shift the momentum in a fundamental manner towards the likelihood of homeostasis. It's going to get worse before it gets better. But we've got the tools to mitigate the severity of that damage. For every point of despair, we've got a point of hope. Next slide, please. When I wrote my second book, The State of Water, Understanding California's Most Precious Resource, I gave it that subtitle with the implication, of course, that the material substance of water is that resource. I was wrong. At the time, I got a lot of questions about why I wasn't writing a book on fire. And I am. It will be here after I finish this new set of field atlases, and we'll close with that series with a book on fire. The State of Fire actually is what it's going to be called, towards what will ultimately be 6 books, but that's an aside. In response to that question about why I'm not writing the Book of Fire now, I point to the interconnectedness of the worlds of policy and ecology. After touring the book and my work around the state, really from San Diego to Crescent City, from Tahoe to Fresno, and all points in between, and engaging with this electric network of our activated citizenry, I realized it isn't water that is our most important resource. It is the preciousness and the rarity of trusting each other enough at all to tell a believable story. Okay, and then our last slide here on this tour through my artwork and my mode of map making. Okay, so not only are our habitat spaces trending towards simplification, fragmentation, and infirmity, so too is our community and our ability to recognize and grow community. Here too, I find hope and feed my stubborn spark of optimism. By naming the problem, by not acquiescing to fear in the face of hype, but rather by shoring up the data that feeds systems of nourishment, whether on a personal, a communal, or on an ecological level at scale, we point a light at the shadow and we tip the scales away from scarcity and towards a new vision of abundance for the human and the more than human world. So with that, I thank you deeply and sincerely for the opportunity to address you all here this morning. And I wish all the best for you personally and your community on this journey over the next 2 days through the symposium. And if you want to get my books, please check me out at californiafieldatlas.com. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Obi. We needed that little injection of hope this morning. So thank you so much. I actually just had a quick question for you. Just in your experience, I know there is oftentimes this struggle of trust, especially with government agencies and others in California. What would be, I mean, what do you see as a way for agencies or State Water Board, where I work, to do a better job at gaining the trust of some of these folks you're out talking to and engaging with?
Well, we have many obstacles, and I really am finding that the platform we're engaging with right now is limited at best. There's a magic that happens when you're in the room with somebody. It's something as old as our species itself, right? So the idea of actually looking into somebody's eyes and feeling their presence is a liability that we have right now, which makes it doubly difficult to exactly where we're going. Now, that all being said, and that's rather a semantic, oblique answer to your question. I think that we have, for the first time in a long time, really, a couple of reason for hope, frankly, from the leadership in Sacramento towards. I have 3 PDFs on my desk right now that read to me like poetry. The first one is getting to neutral, which is the plan of getting California to become a negative carbon emitter by the year 2045. The other one is the 2018 carbon forest plan, or forest carbon plan. And the last one is the Karuk atmospheric plan made by biologists up in the Klamath River Basin. And those 3 PDFs together, I wish, if I had a magic wand, I could put them on everybody's coffee table. Everyone should have them and read them, because it's actually not dry reading at all. In fact, it's as important a story as any that humans have ever told, and will have, and has that level of effect. We here in California, one of the things that we enjoy, of course, is money. $3 trillion GDP, we can do what we want. And it's time for us to, and as these plans demonstrate, we are in fact putting rubber to the road and getting this done towards prioritizing restoration. That's going to take a lot of switching of the old ways of doing things. I mean, I just wrote this book called The Forests of California, in which I argue that so much policy over the past 100 years that the Forest Service has existed at all comes from the logging industry. And we are reckoning with that matter. So I do my work every day towards this idea of geographic literacy. I make these books translating the research science onto a popular level, or at least that is my goal, with the modicum of success now that they've achieved, and continue to thrive with. really believe there is a thirst, a popular thirst for people to learn about this place, to actually finally be from this place. How do you finally be from a place? Well, you got to learn your neighbors. You got to learn at least a modicum of the ecological functionality of this place. It's your responsibility as a citizen. And when you start to do that on a popular level, political will begins to turn. And when political will turns, it's on.
Awesome. And Obi, we've got a few questions trickling in through our Slack channel. William Oda had a question about, what are some of the ways that you've seen for scientists to engage with artists or others to create art or other materials about the research or study system that may connect to people at an individual or emotional level?
What a great question, because I always, I'm always thinking about, extrapolation from the science to the arts, but what about the other way? I'm always thinking about how citizen science might work on a popular level and how that feeds these extremely popular internet-based data collectives like iNaturalist, or I would encourage, though, of course, on the other side of things, for scientists to think about then art. One of my friends and colleagues, who's actually published by the same publishing house that I am, Heyday Books, is named John Muir Laws, and he wrote the field guide to, among other things, the Sierra Nevada. And he is an artist, but he's also a biologist, and he runs this whole program of nature-based journaling, journaling, like how to make a journal, how to represent what you're seeing through your hand. And so that almost opens up a different kind of avenue where it's like this two-way street where you're actually involved in this larger consilience being the word that E.O. Wilson so popularly employed with his book, Consilience, the Unity of All Knowledge, when he suggests that there's these two things, right? There's two schools of knowledge between science and the humanities, and they're both necessary to make meaning happen. And so I think that's a wonderful place to start to think about the generation of field guides, your own personal guide to your own experiences, recording your own observations. I make field atlases, which is a little bit different. I'm not so much concerned with the what of things. I'm more concerned with the how of things. So that's my particular modality and vocation. But yes, please investigate John Muir Law's new book out from Heyday Books called How to Teach Nature Journaling, which is a fantastic field of study.
Cool, I didn't know that was out. I'll have to check that out.
Yeah, please.
There's a couple more.
It's a free PDF too. So that'd be the fourth PDF that should be on everybody's coffee table.
Okay, cool. And there was a question, if you don't mind sending us the 3 that you referenced earlier, and we'll share that with everybody. There were a couple more questions. I think we've got, 3 minutes, if that, according to mine.
Oh, great. I'm glad we have some time for Q&A. Yeah.
We have a little bit. So kind of related to that, last question is, how do you see different audiences engaging with your communication style?
Well, yeah, across the board, right? And I wrote what I wrote for you all here today, knowing I was talking with learned scientists. So I wasn't starting at the beginning, and I was talking with the particular set of vocabulary I knew that wouldn't be over your heads, for example. At the same time, I wanted to present a holistic, hopeful view. I find that this idea of stubborn optimism, which is language often employed by entrepreneurs, right, in the realm of business, like you need that quality of stubborn optimism in order to do anything in the modern American economy. Couple that with the idea of catastrophic success, that if we just keep pushing, and I believe and I feel that this posture of stubborn optimism do not confuse optimism and idealism, right? Optimism is envisioning, based on the data, how the world could be if we point ourselves with that determined intention that way. Like I really shy away from like apocalyptic rhetoric. I think it does a disservice to the movement, to the cause, right? It's a responsibility. Your grandchildren's grandchildren's grandchildren need a California where the biodiversity is intact. I mean, we have, despite the predictive models of how temperature will increase, and how this huge conflagration, this massive epidemic of fire that we have across the state, despite all that, it is my contention that based on my experience, watching how restoration science can influence endangered habitats across the state based on good policy and good effort and good data. We have the opportunity to leave the 21st century with California's natural world in better shape than we left it at the end of the 20th century, which is not something you hear too much about in this din of divisiveness, in this din of fear rhetoric that is that is all pervasive. When in fact, to specifically address your question there, I'm seeing it like affect all walks of industry, as I said in my little keynote there, that it certainly will. We're seeing labor come into this now, where I'm friends with there's this whole restoration industry that has really cropped up from a number of propositions that have successfully been approved through the electorate over the past 15 or so years, where there's a lot of money towards restoration programs, fish habitats and that kind of thing. I'm sure they'll be talking about that too. But we're having a lot of like real basic human negotiation problems where the guy in the backhoe can't get out of the backhoe and pick up a shovel because that guy belongs to a different union. What about engaging labor, capital L, engaging labor to invent a new union of restorationists, put the youthful army of potential labor source to work in order to make this vision come alive for a better California of tomorrow, one that will rightly attend to the proper stewardship of this most beautiful and perilous of all places, California.
Absolutely, Obi, thank you so much. I think
Allie, thank you. I had a great time.
We were, very honored to have you here today. And there were more questions, so we'll probably be funneling those your way or giving them contact information for you.
Oh, sure. You can email me at coyoteandthunder@gmail.com. I love talking to people who are into my work. coyoteandthunder@gmail.com. And thank you all so much. Have a great time today.
All right. Thanks, Obi.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Right, bye. All right. Well, everybody, I think we're all inspired and motivated and have this sense of hope to kickstart CABW. I think one of the big take homes for me is just this idea of, we are generating good science and data to help inform important policy decisions in California. So keep up the good work. And like I said, for those of you that do have questions for Obi or are looking for more information, you can post your questions to the Slack channel and we'll get those to him. We'll also include his email in Slack so you can directly reach out to him if you so choose. So thanks again to Obi. All right, so now we're gonna imagine we're virtually traveling across the globe to talk with our first panel, incorporating temporary streams into monitoring and management, the UK experience. First, I'd like to introduce Rafael Mazur, who will be moderating this panel. Rafi is the principal scientist with the Southern California Coastal Water Research Project, or SCWRP, and he's been helping since 2008 with the Southern California Stormwater Monitoring Coalition to coordinate their stream bioassessment program. Rafi got his PhD from Dr. Vince Fresh at UC Berkeley in 2006, and he focused on temporal and spatial variability and benthic macroinvertebrate data. And currently, Rafi focuses on assessing impacts of hydrologic change in intermittent and ephemeral streams. All right, Rafi, turning it over to you.
All right, thank you, Ali. I'll just get quickly going so we don't fall behind on our schedule. I think one of the silver linings about having an online conference is that you are capable of bringing in a whole new community that you might not normally have access to. And a good example of this would be our colleagues over in the UK. I've known Rachel Stubbington for years through SFS, and I've heard her present some of her work about temporary streams, and I've noticed just how their program has really, expanded in terms of building a whole suite of management tools to help understand the condition of temporary streams, which is something California has done as well. And so I asked Rachel if she could bring some of her colleagues to speak with us today. And so without any further ado, I will have ask Rachel to get the session started. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rafi. I think that Shrika's going to bring up my first slide. Or shall I just click? Maybe I should just, there we go. I'm on it. So yes, I must start by thanking you, Rafi. It's so exciting. I organized an online meeting attended by Americans as well as our usual crew back in June. So it's great to now reciprocate and be able to contribute to this meeting. And so I think you asked me alone at first, and it just didn't seem right. Because we are a team, and I'm so happy that I've been able to arrange to present alongside colleagues today. So our team, we're kind of two organisations. Nottingham Trent is one of Nottingham's top 2 universities, I'll have you know, smack bang in the middle of England, and we are a base. We're a home, and we've got microscopes and things in that home, and we also bring a bit of money to the project. And me, a single expert based there, but just awesome to collaborate with Environment Agency people who bring so much expertise, also contribute financially, and get us access to the rivers that we need to study. So I'm going to tell you more about all of these people, past and present members of the team, on the following slides. And you can see that the vast majority of us have received, financial support, showing real commitments to advancing the protection of temporary streams in the UK. Right, I've clicked now, and then it's just heading over the Atlantic, my click is. With any luck. Are we still on the first slide for you lot? There we go, I'm on. So I put 2 points in this map, thinking that the areas that we study are really, really far apart. But you Americans, you're going to think they're down the road from one another. And so we've got one area of streams where my colleague Judy is based, north of London, and then another in the just north of the Isle of Wight, right on the south coast, near enough. And we're studying winterborne chalk streams. They're protected, and there's particular interest in studying them. And we've really got the opportunity to begin collaborating. And back in, there's Judy England. She's an awesome national scientist for the Environment Agency, and I had the pleasure to meet her when we found ourselves on a train to Brussels together to join this EU cost action, and we represented the UK on this project for 4 years, and in the meantime we started to get some funding to collaborate. Firstly, a tiny pot of money to pay Kate Mathers, a wonderful scientist currently at ERVAG in Switzerland. And this gives you an idea of what some of our streams are like. I think they're a bit different to yours. And this collaboration, it kind of set the scene and convinced us that more was worthwhile. And we got Environment Agency funding for Raman Sarmajan, who was with us for 18 months. All of this research so far was data-based, using existing data to explore the ecology of temporary streams and how their communities respond to intermittence. And that was another highly productive relationship. We still collaborate with Raman, yes, at the moment. He's currently based at Berkeley in California, but went on holiday to UK in March and then lockdown. So he's stuck in England at the moment, but technically employed in America at the moment. And then moving on to the current, I have pressed the button, honest. The current collaborations, we've got, come on. We've got George, you can't see the slides yet. Oh, okay, so this is a photo showing the annual meeting. We have them every year, and we met Tim, you can see him in there. And that gave us funding for our next collaboration, which I'm going to present George's work today. And then since then, I'm sorry, I've clicked, but unfortunately you're not seeing my slides as yet. They'll probably all come at once in a moment. But I'm pleased to say that we've currently got 2 PhDs underway. Chloe, who's shown there, helping George with his field work, and also Kieran. Oh, I am sorry for the lack of synchrony and difficulties in controlling. But yes, this is the current case, that we've got Chloe and Kieran, whose research we'll hear about today. And yes, I was feeling a bit starstruck by OB's presentation, but ultimately we're all about, yes, taking positive action to advance the protection of threatened ecosystems. So very happy to contribute. And if you're lucky, yeah, we go, you get to see a photo. There was even the 9th one was a member of our team of people, 9 people at Nottingham Trent, working together and with Environment Agency partners to advance temporary stream understanding. And you will hear more about our work in the next few presentations. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. That was a really great introduction. I just want to move things along to keep us on schedule. We'll next hear from Judy England, who is a research scientist with the Environment Agency, as Rachel described. And we'll be hearing about why temporary streams in England are so important to researchers and to the government there. Thank you.
Right, hello, hopefully you can hear me. I have pressed.
Yeah, you're loud and clear.
I have pressed click, but it doesn't seem. Oh, there we go. So yes, thank you, Rachel, for inviting me to join you in our trip to America. I wish we were there in person. It'd be much nicer and warmer there than it is here at the moment. So just to, I have pressed click, it will appear in a second. So just to give you a bit of background, I work for the Environment Agency, as does Tim, who you will hear from in a minute. This just gives you an idea of who we are and what our responsibilities are. So we're a bit of your EPA, a bit of your Fish and Wildlife, and a bit of your Army Corps of Engineers. So we have a remit to protect and look after our river systems in the UK. I have pressed click. Yep, there we go. So why are we interested in temporary rivers? Obviously, they're a big part of the network and they're everywhere. We call them temporary rivers as a shortcut for saying intermittent rivers and ephemeral streams, because that's too long to say. The analogy is with your dryland rivers, but we don't call them that. But because quite frankly, it's a lot wetter and colder over here. So just to give you an idea of the type of rivers we have the chalk stream in the sort of top left, we have limestone streams, we have upland woodland streams, upland mountain streams, and we even have temporary rivers that dry.
Judy, we can click over here on our end just to
yes,
avoid the lag. Okay.
Thank you. Click,
You're
please.
welcome.
So yes, Rachel introduced you to our lovely chalk streams. Unlike your rivers that are intermittent, these are very passive systems. They are groundwater fed and they sort of come and go very gently within our systems. They don't experience the peak flows that you do, and they're sort of very well loved and renowned within our society. We have 80% of the world's chalk streams within our little country, and they're renowned for their biodiversity and various protections. Within the chalk streams, we have natural drying beaches. So this is a winter-born section. So it sort of transitions from flowing to low flows, ponded, and then to dry, and then round the cycle again. Slide, please. However, they're not all as beautiful as that. They're under a threat from lots of sort of pressure and man-made influences. So that comes from everything from groundwater abstraction for drinking water, diffuse pollution, and then physical modifications. You can see sort of building right up to the banks, and cattle poaching we mean by trampling. It's not quite what you probably mean by cattle poaching. And also climate change. Although they don't have massive peak flows, they have been sort of modified as part of land drainage activities and also to run mills back in sort of Victorian times in the UK. Slide, please. So as part of our collaboration and meeting Rachel, we started thinking about how we can sort of use academic understanding and knowledge to enhance the way that we manage and understand these river systems. So working with Rachel and some hydrologists, we've looked at characterising and quantifying the aquatic phases. How often are they dry, how quick the transition is, whether they dry or whether they remain ponded, all those sorts of questions, and what sort of metrics we can use to understand these systems. And then how can we use that with our biological data to test the metrics that we use. Most of our river monitoring is in our perennial section, so all the tools that we have are designed for rivers that don't dry up. So we wanted to assess how those work under intermittent conditions, whether they're sufficient, whether we need alternative tools, and how we can assess the quality of these river systems despite the intermittence. Slide, please. So the first big project that we had was working with Roman Saramajan, who Rachel mentioned earlier. He did this amazing study looking at using two of the biotic indices that we use on our perennial systems, the Life and the Delhi index, and looked at how these macroinvertebrate indices respond due to drying within the sort of chalk stream rivers just north of London, which Chloe will talk about in a minute. From this study, we found all sorts of information, such as it takes up to 3 years to recover once a channel's dried. That's if it's a section of channel that only dries under sort of severe drought conditions. But the erratic intermittent sites that dry more regularly respond much quicker. And obviously that was reflected in the different sorts of taxa and the habitat preferences that they had. So from that study, we found that one of the recommendations was that, yes, we can use the metrics for the perennial systems, and they do have some benefit, but we're better off developing an index that included some of the rarer taxa that we find in these river systems that we don't always record. Slide, please. Or rather that we capture that we don't actually record within our index. So again, working with some guidance from Rachel and her team, we developed a new biotic index called the MIS index, which is designed to track intermittence within river systems. So we basically categorize all the invertebrates we caught from those in 6 groups that we've got there, from low tick fast through to the terrestrial animals that start colonizing the river channel as it dries. So this is reliant on sampling the aquatic phase, but sampling in a way that we capture all those semi-aquatic and terrestrial things that start colonizing the shallow river margins once we start, as the river starts drying. So the idea behind this index is that we can track the intermittence and look at the change in the different communities as they respond to changes in aquatic state, and then from that the looking at the pressure of groundwater abstraction, so we can start to distinguish between natural intermittence and anthropogenic intermittence. Slide, please. Similarly, we've been working with, again, with Rachel, under Rachel's guidance, but with some plant specialists looking at a complementary metric that works on the plant communities. As you will have seen from the earlier earlier photos, that the chalk streams have quite diverse plant communities. One of the best things about this methodology is the same survey, which is a 100-meter section of river bed, including sort of shallow banks. We can use the same methodology as the river transitions between flowing, ponded and dry states. So again, we can track the community change in response to intermittence. This has only recently been published, and the MIS index was last year. So these are very new metrics, and we're hoping that people will take them forward and start applying them and testing them both within other temporary rivers in the UK, but across the world. They're all designed that they can be easily updated with alternative taxa to reflect the ones recorded in the different river types. Slide, please. Oh, that slide's not come out very well. There's lots of lines. Anyway, those sort of strange lines at the top were, oh, back up, please. Those are supposed to be pressure response relationships of the different sort of interactions that we have. I don't really know how to describe them. Basically, we're looking at how different indices respond under to disentangle the response due to intermittence and other pressures. In the left graph is due to looking at a relationship with pressure response where perennial and intermittent rivers overlap. The solid lines represent the perennial systems, the dotted line, the intermittent rivers. And if we had a perfect metric, it would have total overlap between the response in perennial and intermittent systems, in which case we can use it as a perfect index. The second one, where we got the yellow smiley face, is where we've got an additive relationship where the pressure response is different within a perennial and intermittent system, but they are parallel, so we can actually sort of use that metric and take some sort of account of the intermittence. And then the rest of the graphs representing anergistic, synergistic and opposing relationships. So basically there's no parallel in the pressure response relationship in intermittent and perennial streams. This is part of an ongoing research project that Rachel's leading on behalf of the cost action. Although the cost action has finished, the collaboration continues, which we're very happy about. And that's Rachel there digging some dry phase samples of her river. So Rachel's working on this project and hopefully we can hear more about it soon. Next slide, please. So thinking about the future, what we're currently working on is trying to understand how these river systems will change under different climate change effects. So we're creating conceptual diagrams looking at how climate change might affect the groundwater, the rain patterns, how that will affect the patterns of intermittence. What we expect is we'll always have a perennial head, so there'll always be a perennial section, but we expect the winterborne section to expand and become more variable in its hydraulic nature. So we're looking at how that might likely translate into the ecological response. Next slide, please. And our challenge that we've given to Rachel and her crew is how can we develop biomonitoring tools for the dry phase? We've got ones that work for perennial phase that we can sort of use in an intermittent river, and we've developed specific metrics for that. But we need the tools that we can go back any time of the year and understand the quality of the dry phase. We've also want to understand what actually lives within our dry river channels. Our winterborne systems have some particularly rare taxa that are adapted to live under those drying conditions. We want to know whether we've got the terrestrial equivalent of rare taxa that come in and exploit the river as it dries. Next slide, please. Apologies for the bit of confusion in the slide in the middle. Thank you very much for listening, and if you've got any questions, please put them on Slack and we'll be happy to attempt to answer them later. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Judy. That was really great. We're going to move on to keep on schedule. Next, we'll hear from Tim Sykes, who is also works with the Environment Agency, and he's going to talk about, well, a chalk stream winterborne case study. So let's hear from Tim now.
Good morning. I'm going to introduce you to the Candover Brook, which is a chalk stream winterborne, and I'll try to illustrate some of the pressures that Judy has described to you. The Candover Brook is a tributary of the River Itchen, which is found in central southern England. It's about 10 kilometers long, and the upper 6 kilometers or so is winterborne and temporary, and the lower part is perennial in nature. The perennial chalk stream is typical of many chalk streams. It's famous for its crystal clear water and its flinty gravel bed. That supports a phenomenal range of macrophytes. On the left slide there is watercress and fool's watercress. And on the right-hand slide, you can see water crowfoot, ranunculus in flower. And that prolific life, macrophyte life, and the substrate creates a huge surface area, which then is a framework for a wide variety of macroinvertebrates. So chalk streams are well known for their biodiversity and their bioabundance. They're also well known for their aesthetics and ethereal feel, which that central slide aims to portray. Just waiting for that. No, okay, here we go. Shuka, maybe you could take control after this slide, please, to avoid the delay. Thank you. But we're interested in the winterborne part of the Candover Brook, the upper part. And in landform, it's a fairly simplistic plan and form of a shallow ditch in the valleys. And it's often full of soil and sediment. But when it's in its flowing phase, the gravels are quickly exposed. And this picture on the right, I took just a couple of weeks ago, and you can see the clarity of the water, and you can see the flinty substrate there. There's some a few macrophytes, there's some algae, but most of it is just grass, which is fairly typical of many of our winterborns. Shuka, if you can move on, thank you. In their dry phase, that flinty substrate is exposed and can be for a long period of time, many months, and is home for an interesting community of flora and fauna, some of which we're going to hear about later. If it's exposed sometimes for years, it's colonized by grasses and herbaceous perennials. Thank you, Shuka. Next slide, please. Thank you. These chalk stream winterbournes do not escape heavy engineering, physical modifications. In their dry phase in particular, they are evidently not highly valued, and so become, in this case, a roadside ditch, very simple in its plan form, and accepts road runoff and associated pollutants. It's also culverted. On the left-hand side there, the solid blue line is aiming to show you where the winterbourne channel is visible, and the dotted blue line is where it's been ploughed up. So you can see by a green strip next to the dotted line, the old watercourse, but it's ploughed up now annually and under crops for much of the year. One of the consequences of that is that the conveyance of water is impeded. And so those houses you can see at the top of the picture are at risk of flooding because the water is impounded and can't flow away. It would be very nice one day, one of my ambitions would be to restore that watercourse. Yes, please. And the Candover is also not immune to many of the classic pressures for our headwaters, and water quality is a particularly notable one. This image shows a piece of kit called a chem catcher. You can buy them quite cheaply off the internet, and it's a passive way of measuring water quality, especially nutrients such as phosphate. It was put in the river here, just downstream of the confluence of the Candover with the River Itchen, by a charity, an environmental charity, with the intention of measuring the amount of phosphates in the river. After only 2 weeks, they went back to get it and found this scene. The prolific algal growth here is obviously indicative of a highly nutrient status. And so this picture, I think, has become quite not only ironic, but also iconic, because nature itself is telling us that there's an imbalance of nutrients in the system here. Of course, algae itself is not a bad thing and it's a natural part of the system, but when it's so out of balance and it's smothering other macrophytes, it has an adverse ecological impact. The picture on the right, the blue blob, is a modeled extent of a cone of depression in groundwater from the use of 3 boreholes that are shown there in small red circles. And it was proposed to increase abstraction from those groundwater boreholes. And the environmental regulator, the Environment Agency for which I work, identified risks to not only the Candover itself, which is the pink line running north to south in the middle of the blue blob, but also to neighbouring headwater streams, the River Deva in the west, the River Wey in the east, and the River Arle in the south, which is another tributary of the River Itchen. And we refused the application to increase that abstraction because of ecological risks. The water company appealed, and it went to what we call a public inquiry, which is kind of a court, a planning court, where the government appoint a minister, an inspector rather, to take an objective balance of the evidence and come up with a decision. And in this case, the inspector came down on the side of the Environment Agency, declaring that the hydrological changes that would result from this abstraction would have unacceptable ecological risks. Thank you, Shuka. So the Candover escaped pressures on that occasion, but how do we protect it going forwards? Don't forget the Candover is a tributary of the River Itchen and is therefore being protected through the Test and Itchen Catchment Partnership. That's an assemblage of a wide number of organisations, including statutory bodies, environmental charities, representatives of landowners and river owners, water companies and other businesses, and so on and so forth. And this partnership is aiming to collate and understand information about winterbournes and to plan out a route by which we can protect them better. Thank you, Shuka. And some of their recent success includes securing a significant grant from government, just under £2 million, and then met by over £1 million from the stakeholders. We've just launched a £3.2 million programme, 5-year programme, to protect the winterbournes in the upper parts of the Test and the Itchen. So just to be clear, the main river Test and the river Itchen are in the centre of the screen here. And the project isn't seeking to protect the main rivers themselves. It's aiming to protect the surface water catchment and the groundwater catchments of these headwater temporary streams. So the Watercress and Winterbournes project, thank you, Shika. In order to put together the bid for funding, we engaged with a large number of stakeholders, including the local communities and landowners themselves. And you can see here in the case of the Candover, some of their issues or ambitions for the river include understanding more about what lives in it, protecting and restoring cultural heritage, increasing access to the Winterbourne so that people can enjoy it more and benefit from it, as well as reconnecting it with its floodplain. Thank you, Shuka. One of the things we'll do is to carry out some physical enhancements to the channel, reversing damage to physical form. This is an example of some work we did several years ago in the Winterbourne, where the landowner had used the dry channel as a means of access for his vehicles and tractors and things, which had compacted the gravels. Yes, please, Shuka. And so what we modified we changed some of the morphology. We just pushed around some of the natural gravels in the channel. We didn't introduce any new gravel, which we do sometimes with classic chalk stream restoration. Here we were just trying to change the form. Obviously, if the river's in its dry phase, it may have little benefit, but in its wet phase, it's causing a greater variation, a heterogeneity in form and hydrology, which has benefited the ecology. Thank you, Shuka. Of course, presenting to a large number of ecologists interested in bioassessment, I thought I'd better include an image of some wildlife. And here's a newt that I recently found under a stone in the upper Candover in the Winterbourne. Newts in England are relatively common. Across Europe, they're increasingly rare, and they're protected. And typically, they'll hibernate in the winter. But this one in the summer in the Candover seemed to be surviving quite well. The Candover had been dry for many months and was to remain so for many months afterwards. But carrying out bioassessment is an important part of the Winterbournes in Watercress project, and particularly through citizen science. So we're training and enabling local people to monitor the ecology and the health of their own local Winterbourne. Thank you, Shuka. And finally, the Watercress and Winterbournes project is keen to fund research. And here are people looking at the form and function of the upper Candover. The more we can understand this ecosystem, the better we as managers can manage it and enhance it or restore it. And so we'll hear some more about that later today. Thank you, Shuka. So that my time is up. I hope I've been able to give you an insight into the Candover. It's not unique for chalk stream Winterbournes. In fact, it's quite typical in terms of the pressures that it's facing, but that there is a program of work to restore it, and there is a great deal of interest and hope in the local communities that it can be improved both for wildlife and people. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim. That was really great. It gives us a good idea of what kind of streams you're talking about and how they're similar to the ones we're dealing with in California. So we're now going to go back to Rachel to hear about the development of terrestrial invertebrate-based bioindicators for these winterborne streams. Thank you.
I'll try and unmute myself, and then I will try and make some time. First of all, I must say this is George's research, and that is not George, that is Becky. But she was one of his many and varied helpers in the field, and I'm going to be finding out what this Tim-funded, George-led research taught us about the terrestrial invertebrate communities that live in winterborne streams. Click next, whatever the magic word is. Okay, so this is the one stream that Tim has just introduced us to. Click, it's in a particularly protected and yes, valued area. Go on, click. And so what do we want to do? We need better methods to enable us to be able to monitor the health of these ecosystems, whatever they're like when we arrive. So this happens in England, that you turn up and you're expecting your stream to be dry and it's wet, or you're expecting it to be wet and it's dry. So we need to be prepared. We need methods that use the terrestrial invertebrates as well. Along the way, we want to find out what these communities are actually like. Nobody knows in this country as yet. We want to know if they contain species of conservation interest, and we want to know what the communities as a whole, what value do they have in terms of their conservation status. Next. So what did we do? What did George do? I'm not sure if I did any of this. So what did George do? And look, there's Tim and two of George's helpers in one dry channel. We sampled the communities, click. And just 5 sites in this initial survey. And they were certainly distinguished by their dry duration though. Some sites, when we first sampled them in summer, had been dry for just 2 weeks, others for more than 1 year, and others for more than 3 years. Click. And we also, because we were not just interested in the ecology, but developing methods, and so we tried 2 methods. This method, I genuinely want to know if you use this word, but that to us is a pooter, for the pooting with. So there is Catherine pooting, sucking up invertebrates as part of a ground search. And we also used pitfall traps, so setting traps and leaving them in situ for either 7 days or 24 hours. So click, that is a short period compared to the Natural England guidelines of 2 to 4 weeks for pitfall traps. But Tim said, you ain't gonna catch us leaving them in place for 2 to 4 weeks. We need to know if shorter durations are feasible to characterize the communities. We also wanted to know about seasonal variability, and therefore 9 weeks apart, we took pitfall traps, 7-day pitfall traps, because early on we knew that they performed by far the best. Click. The identification level is really mixed. So we did beetles really well. I don't know if you use the same word for woodlice, but there's one just there. And we did them pretty well. But things like spiders and springtails, we identified as spiders and springtails. So a bit limited or a bit mixed in terms of the identification level. Click. We also characterize the physical environments. Kieran and Chloe, I think, are both going to tell you about this survey method for characterizing the physical habitats. So click. And oh, my nice picture has gone. See if you can bring it up, Shuka. There should be a picture under there. But never mind if not. We also use standard indices yeah, never mind, the pictures have all gone. So on one. back one. We use some conservation indices to characterize and quantify the rarity, the richness and the rarity of these communities. We also benefited from online databases that provided information about their habitat and resource preferences. Click. So what did we find? Well, even though we only really looked at beetles and woodlice, we got 138 taxa. So that was magnificent. But yeah, how many more might there be? That's a little springtail up there. We didn't do them. 33% of individuals. Is that one family, 10 species, 20 species? Not a clue. But beetles, we found high species richness, in particular for the ground beetles, the carabids, and you can see that some of them have got purple bits and some of them have got green spots. But I'm not allowed to talk about that because I've only got 3 minutes left. Click. And so our 7-day pitfalls, they were the ones that we were good enough to look at differences between those 3 site types, one that had been dry for 2 to 9 weeks compared to ones that had been dry for years. And we found no difference in richness between sites that had been dry for different durations, but we did find compositional differences. For example, there were no woodlice at all at the short dry sites and none of some ground beetles at the long dry sites. Click. All I want to say for this one is really look between short dry and mid and medium dry and long dry, richness is pretty comparable. Abundance is still reasonably high, even at the short dry sites that had just been dry for 2 or 9 weeks. And that quality index of conservation, there's no apparent difference based on these 5 sites for that as well. Click. Awesome. Just look at that top left site. It's not great, is it? But it still had a species of conservation interest in it. And overall, in this one small study of 5 sites, we found 4 nationally rare or scarce beetles. Click. So recommendations. 7-day pitfall traps. So there's one in the photo, just plastic cups. They do seem better than other methods. And if you can only select one season, summer is a better season than autumn. That would be our single recommendation. Click. But if you want to characterize biodiversity, then 2 methods are better. Some species we only found using ground searches, and there were a lot of differences between seasons. So 2 seasons and 2 methods will certainly get you more species if that is your goal. Click. But this really brings us on to, what is the goal? So thinking about that 3rd bullet there, what do we, even if we want to assess everything, what do we need to look at in order to be able to assess ecological quality? Will just the carabids do? And also, what do we mean by ecological quality? Which particular aspects of it? Nutrients? Maybe not for the carabids. Maybe geomorphology is what they might be particularly likely to respond to. She says stop. So Kieran's PhD. He can tell you about that himself. Click, and I thank you.
Thank you very much, Rachel. That was really exciting to hear about. As you know, California's been working on similar tools as well.
I do.
So next we're going to hear from Chloe Hayes, who will tell us about plants as indicators of condition in temporary streams.
Thank you. Sorry, I couldn't unmute myself then. Shuka, would you mind changing the slides for me, please? So I'm Chloe Hayes. I'm a 3rd year PhD student at Nottingham Trent University, and I'm here to talk to you about plant biomonitors in temporary streams. So temporary stream flora, they're widespread and abundant, and they range in communities from persisting aquatics to terrestrial herbs, grasses. Despite this, there's very few studies on dry phase flora. A lot of it focuses on perennial systems, or it focuses on like macroinvertebrates. In studies that do include dry phase flora, focus is often on the influence of flow regime. And even in these studies, a lot of the time, dry phase plant communities, the terrestrial species are often just grouped together. So they don't have the species level information. So you lose a lot of information there. So dry phase plant communities are not fully characterized. Next slide, please. So plants potential as biomonitors, they are easily identifiable, widely abundant, sessile, which is a major bonus for them, and they also respond readily to environmental parameters. Our current methods that we sort of use, so there's Ellenberg, which is European, and this is involving sort of assigning categories according to tolerances, but this is very general and not specific to temporary streams. There's mean trophic rank, which is a UK one method, and that involves macrophytes and their responses to nutrients. And then there's the new plant flow index, which Judy mentioned, and that looks at dry phase responses to flow, but doesn't, again, the terrestrial species are sort of put in a single group, and there's no species level information, which is showing us the potential aspects of quality that plants can identify as nutrients, organic material, land use, moisture, and sediment composition. And we need to know more about these dry phase sites to be able to aid managers in monitoring the temperature of their sites dry. Next slide, please. So the aims of this part of my PhD are to characterize the dry phase floral communities found in temporary chalk streams, investigate changes in dry phase communities in response to differing environmental conditions, and to therefore inform the biomonitoring and management. Next slide, please. So the study catchment I work on is the Colne catchment. So I'm with Judy, working north of London. The Colne catchment feeds into the Thames and has chalk geology. So as Judy mentioned, this means that my streams are groundwater fed. So they have they flow during the winter and dry during the summer, though this can vary with different sites. The land use in the area is typically agricultural and urban, and there are no water bodies in the catchment at good ecological status due to reasons such as phosphates, fine sediments, invasive species, and abstraction. Abstraction is quite a big impact on the rivers in this catchment, and can influence if we can tell whether intermittence is natural or whether it is an influence by abstraction. Next slide, please. So my study sites, I have 14 study sites across 4 rivers: the River Ver, the River Misbourne, the River Bulbourne, and the River Gade. I went to do some preliminary sort of field visits to select my sites, and I selected them according to these environmental parameters here. So hydrological state, whether the stream was flowing, ponded, or dry. All my sites did dry during the survey period, but some dried at different times to others and for different durations. And then other things include shade trampling by cattle, sheep, and horses, morphology, so the shape of the river, the slope of the banks, that sort of thing, nutrient concentrations and organic matter of the substrate, and sediment moisture and composition. Next slide, please. To characterize my dry phase plant communities, I took 100-meter sections and did in-channel bank and riparian surveys. So the riparian area was from the bank. I went out 10 meters from there. I did estimated percentage plant cover and identified to species where or lowest possible level. In some of the earlier surveys, it was harder to do this if identifying features hadn't yet developed. The survey period was once a month for 3 to 4 days, and I did surveys between March and October in order to get from when flow tended to sort of stop to when flow generally resumed. Next slide, please. To characterize the physical habitat, I use morph surveys or modular river physical surveys, Rachel mentioned them briefly. They are a citizen science tool that we use over here to characterize our physical habitat. So we collect information on flow types, sediment types, the number of flow and sediment types, vegetation morphology, any direct modifications to the river, so any bank or in-channel modifications, and also invasive species. And then these are assigned a abundance category, and then you put them into a system and they give us some indices which we can then use. I also collected additional information on sediment composition and moisture, land use, poaching or trampling, and shade. And I also took substrate samples for pH, nutrient concentrations, organic matter content, and sediment grain size analysis, which I then did later in the lab. Next slide, please. So I've done some preliminary analysis and I did some community composition visualization in relation to the abiotic drivers for April and May's data. And as you can see from here, I've got substrate moisture, which was the only one with significant differences between communities. So the dry communities tended to cluster together, and the wet and moist categories tended to cluster together. But from my observations, I predict that as streams dry further in the future months, other environmental factors will also have influence on these communities. Next slide, please. So my observations were that aquatic species, as you maybe expect, persisted in streams which dried later. So these streams on the left, well, one of them is still flowing in that picture. The aquatic species there persisted throughout the whole of the dry phase to when flow resumed, whereas the ones on the right had much longer dry phases, and they tended not to have as many aquatic species there. Next slide, please. Sites with higher nutrients and organic matter tended to have higher abundance but lower richness. So the ones on the left had higher nutrients and they tended to be dominated by 1 or 2 species, whereas the ones on the right had lower levels of nutrients and organic matter and tended to have more of a diverse community, but with perhaps lower abundances of species. Next slide, please. Adjacent land uses affected communities. So the top 2 there were streams that were in residential areas. So they were actually influenced by some planting in the rivers, and ones that are in the middle 2 there, they are at sites that were like pastoral sort of recreational grassland. So they were tended to be dominated by grasses, and the bottom 2 there are what we could term as more natural, and they tended to have diverse communities of herbs, grasses, that sort of thing. Next slide, please. And then there was increased diversity at sites with greater complex sediment composition. So the ones on the left had much more gravels and pebbles in their sediments, whereas the ones on the right were much soilier, and the soilier sites tended to be dominated again by grasses. Next slide, please. Yeah, so as you can see here, the ones on the right are much soilier than the ones on the left, and this tended to mean that the ones on the left have more diverse communities because of the greater complex sediment composition. Next slide, please. However, I believe that it's obviously a combination of all these communities, a combination of all these environmental variables impacting on the community. So I need to do further analysis on community composition in response to environmental variables for all months that I surveyed, and analysis of differences in indices and metrics in response to environmental variables. Next slide, please. And so the take-home messages from this is that even though there is no current characterization of dry phase plants or dry phase plant biomonitors, plants do have a potential as biomonitors of land use, sediment composition, sediment nutrients, and sediment moisture. And biomonitoring needs to include these dry phase plants to allow managers to monitor sites fully and accurately. Slide, please. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chloe. That was really, really interesting to hear about the development of all these different types of biological indicators for temporary streams. Next, we're going to hear from Kieran, who will tell us about, Kieran Gething, a student at Nottingham Trent University, who will talk to us about using terrestrial invertebrate richness and rarity for basically performing conservation value assessments. So Kieran, thanks.
Thank you for the introduction. So yeah, I'm Kieran. My PhD focuses on temporary streams in the south of England, particularly the Candover that we heard a little bit from Tim about. But because of COVID, I've been stuck inside for 8 months. So I've been identifying sites of high conservation value from simple habitat surveys with secondary data. So get a click working, or is it going to be slow? Okay, so I think the easiest way to describe what I've been doing is with a little scenario. So let's imagine you manage a nature reserve. Hopefully we'll get some visuals in a minute. After this slide, I'll let you do the slides because I've got quite a lot of animations on this slide. Sorry. So, oh, we're zooming through now. Okay, so if we imagine that you manage a nature reserve, you have funding to improve the habitat at one site, and you maybe have the resources, either yourself or some volunteers, to go out and survey invertebrates on the ground at 5 sites. That's all well and good if you know the nature reserve really well, but maybe you don't know the place very well. Maybe you've been brought in as a contractor. There are over 40 sites in the little nature reserve mock-up that we've got on the right-hand side there. So how are you going to narrow down this list? Is there a quick way that you can go in and decide where to direct your biomonitoring resources and ultimately direct this funding? So the research goal was to predict invertebrate assemblage characteristics from a simple habitat survey. Could I have a click, please? So the data, I was using secondary data for this. We managed to get hold of 91 terrestrial invertebrate samples from 39 sites that are shown on the left, on the right. And from the 91 samples, I extracted the beetle taxa. They're quite a diverse group and they respond to a range of indicators. I calculated taxonomic richness for each sample and a species quality score. So essentially what that is, every single species in the data set gets assigned a score based on its conservation value. And then if that species occurs in a sample, that score gets added to a running total, and rare species score higher than common species. Could I have a click, please? Thank you. So to do habitat surveys to kind of characterize where these beetles are living, I use the modular river survey. As Chloe said, it kind of characterizes the physical habitat elements. Morph itself calculates 14 indicators from this habitat survey, but I used 4. I used an indicator of habitat complexity, an indicator of vegetation complexity, anthropogenic land cover, and a sediment characterization, which I adjusted a little bit to make it fit with my statistics. Could I have a click, please? And then 2 more clicks. So these are the exposed riverine sediment sites that the data is collected at. They are all perennial sites. That's the nature of working with secondary data. This is all we could get hold of. But as you can see, there's a range of sediment types, a range of vegetation regimes, and the rivers are quite different in their character. Could I get a click, please? So how are we going to analyze this? Basically, what I did with this data was I told the analysis, this is what the habitat is like at this site. So what the analysis sees is these 4 indicators: habitat complexity, vegetation complexity, anthropogenic land cover, and sediment type. So that's what it thinks the habitat is like. And then I told it the answers. I said, beetle richness is this, and the quality score is this. So I've essentially told it the answers, and I've said, please go away and learn this relationship. If I have a habitat that looks like this, what beetle richness and what quality score would I expect to see? Could I get a click, please? Thank you. So then the next stage is to say, okay, you've learned the relationship between the habitat and the and what lives there. This time, I'm going to give you a subsample and say, this is what the habitat is like. I would like the analysis to have a guess at what actually lives there. So from the 91 samples that we had to start with, to kind of train the model, that first stage where it had all of the information, both the habitat and the answers, we gave it 70 samples. And then for this second stage, we gave it the remaining 21 samples where we say, this is what the habitat is like. We would like you to have a guess at what lives there, essentially. One more click, please. And then we're going to interpret that for kind of management outcomes. It's if we did this again, if we were going to go collect data ourselves, how would we maybe adapt the surveys and do them better for this kind of purpose? Click, please. Thank you. So this is the result for the first 70 samples, the training. So essentially, every single point on this graph has associated with it, obviously, a taxonomic richness and a quality score. That's what's plotted. But each point also in the background has information on habitat complexity, vegetation complexity, anthropogenic land cover, and sediment characteristics at each site. So this is kind of the relationship that the model had to learn from, the analysis had to learn. So in any predictions that we make, we would hope to see a similar kind of relationship. So at lower levels of taxonomic richness, we would get less rare species, and at higher levels of taxonomic richness, we would expect to see more rare species. Could I have a click, please? And one, oh, yeah, that's it. So on the left-hand side there, these are the actual values for the 21 sites for which the analysis was given habitat information, but not the answers. So we can see that follows a very similar trend. Low richness, low number of rare species, high richness, high number of rare species. On the right, there is the prediction that the analysis made. It's not perfect, but it is pretty good. We still get this same kind of trend, low richness, low rarity, high richness, high rarity. And if we have a click, just a simple correlation between them, we can see that we're getting over 65%, a very significant correlation between what was actually living there and the predictions that we've made. Could I get a click, please? Okay, so takeaway messages, coming back to the goal of the research. In principle, yes, we can predict assemblage characteristics from simple habitat surveys if we need to. But if we were going to do this again, if we were going to adapt morph or another survey, or we were going to go out and create a survey specifically for this purpose, what should we do to improve the accuracy of these predictions? Could I get a click, please? Thank you. So select, it sounds obvious, but select a specific biotic group. If you go too narrow, if you select a genus with 2 species in it and they both have a similar habitat preference, you're now looking at presence absence. That's not really going to tell you very much about your habitat. Equally, if you go too broad, you probably won't be able to find indicators which accurately characterize their responses to their environment. The second point is to identify factors known to influence the biotic group. And this is a point on specificity. So for this study, we used an indicator of vegetation complexity, when the literature would suggest that beetles probably respond more strongly to things like vegetation density. So in selecting indicators or developing indicators, we need to understand exactly which element of vegetation your beetles are responding to, or whatever your target organism is responding to, and then develop indicators around that. And a click, please. So we need to ensure that we're characterizing a full range of conditions, because anything which lies outside the range of conditions characterized by your habitat indicator will introduce error into your predictions. And then a final point, one more click, is go out and verify these predictions with sampling. So coming back to the scenario, it's all well and good to go out and survey all 40 sites and say this is the best one, but we would always advocate going out and surveying those 5 sites and making sure you spend your funding at the best site. So it's essentially to go and ground truth any predictions that you make. One more click, please. Next steps, next year, if they actually let me go outside, I will go and test this in the Candover with Tim. Final slide. And that's just the references for Morph, for the database we use to calculate the quality score, and thanks to the funders. Thank you.
Thank you, Kieran. That was really fascinating. We're going to go back to Tim for the final talk of the session before we have our panel discussion. So please go ahead and enter some questions into the Slack that you'd like this team to answer. But Tim's going to talk about public perception of dry streams. And I think this is a topic that'll be really fascinating for a lot of us. So thank you, Tim.
Thank you. I'm going to talk to you a bit about the research that I've only recently started into public perceptions of our dry temporary streams, focusing mainly on chalk stream winterbournes. Next slide, please. The chalk streams themselves are revered in England and throughout Northern Europe for not only for their rich biodiversity, but also for their ethereal feel. They're often described as being sublime in nature. And John Muir here summarizes quite well, I think, our connection with rivers that applies very much to chalk streams. It's worth noting here as an aside that John Muir had certain attitudes and behaviors that today we would describe as unacceptable, but he did have an insight and a way of describing our relationship with wilderness that has caused me to quote him here. Next slide, please. But what about our relationship when the rivers are dry? Chalk stream winterbournes, as you've heard, go through a natural phase of flowing, like in the top right picture here, to pooling and drying. Next slide, next please. And how do we feel when the rivers are dry? As Benjamin Franklin almost said, when the chalk stream is dry, we know the worth of water. And he was talking about water supply, but it applies very much to water in rivers as well. Next slide, please. So I'm going to describe some of the values that we appear to ascribe to chalk stream winterbournes through the lens of cultural ecosystem services. And perhaps the best one is aesthetic value. So chalk stream winterbournes, when they're flowing phase, have many of the attributes of a classic perennial chalk stream. Next slide, please. And are often described as beautiful in nature, especially on social media. Next slide, please. But who would describe a pooling winterbourne or even a dry winterbourne as being beautiful or aesthetically pleasing? Perhaps only invertebrate ecologists. Next slide, please. Cultural heritage is an important cultural ecosystem service, and it's perhaps no accident that many of our most important cultural sites in England are found next to winterbournes and in temporary springs. This is Salisbury Hill. It's near Stonehenge, which is of global importance as a Neolithic site. And this and other sites of importance of cultural and spiritual value and perhaps other values too, are located next to temporary streams, perhaps by accident, or perhaps because they had a more meaningful value in the past. Next slide, please. And the next slide as well, please. Certainly, chalk stream winterbournes have a place in our folklore. They're not forgotten, and they're not completely overlooked in terms of our cultural heritage. Next slide, please. What about the inspiration, for example, for arts? Are our temporary streams of any inspiration to us? Well, certainly chalk streams have inspired some famous art in England and Europe. And Thomas Hardy wrote his poem In Front of the Landscape in his native Wessex in southern England at a time when the chalk streams were in flood and groundwater levels were exceedingly high. And I'd like to think that when he talks about rills in the grass flat, he's perhaps looking at a view very much like this one. It's very ephemeral. There is no discernible channel. There's certainly no discernible aquatic wildlife there. It's just a wet field. But perhaps that did inspire him. Next slide, please. And chalk stream winterbournes certainly have recognized spiritual values. On the right here, we have a chapel that's actually built literally on top of the source of the nailbourne, which is a winterbourne. People visit that, and I wonder what they feel when they visit and it's dry. I intend to find out. I'm going to ask them. And on the left here, we have Swallowhead Springs. This is the spring at the source of the River Kennet next to Silbury Hill, which we saw a moment ago. And this is a site of pilgrimage. This has pagan rituals carried out, and it's clearly of a spiritual value to a number of people who will sometimes travel a long way to see it. Next slide, please. And they carry out votive offerings even. It's a place of great importance to many people. Next slide, please. But the question is it the actual water there that's of importance to them, or is it the groundwater? And groundwater for us in southern England is a great source of water supply for us. But I do wonder if people are cognizant of the groundwater beneath their feet, or whether these sites are only of value when the water is flowing. I'll return to that in a moment. Next slide, please. And Wellbeing is a well-known cultural ecosystem service, and the character here, Alistair on the left, clearly places a great deal of value in swimming in a perennial chalk stream. For him, that's pretty much the greatest thing on earth. But similarly, the character on the right here, Bill, he's pretty impressed. He's gaining a value with a dry chalk stream. And of course, you can't help but notice that the image he's sent has absolutely no resemblance whatsoever to any kind of stream. So one presumes that he is familiar with the natural cycle of winterbourne streams. He knows this is sometimes a chalk stream, and that hasn't stopped him deriving some pleasure from it and a calmness that contributes towards well-being. I wonder how common such views like that are. Next slide, please. And so one wonders if we could improve information and understanding about the natural temporary nature of some chalk streams, the winterbournes, whether we might not engender a greater appreciation of them and multiply or amplify the benefits that people perceive they derive from them. Next slide, please. Of course, the quality of the value that you place on your chalk stream depends upon its condition. Here's a chalk stream north of London. Clearly does not display any of the characteristics of a typical chalk stream. Clearly, it's not valued by society in a number of different ways. And one of them is that the water company over-abstracts water here, which contributes, along with climate change and land use changes, to it being dry, literally dry. And this should be a perennial chalk stream. Next slide, please. Similarly, one wonders if society is really valuing our groundwater when it comes to their quality. The toxic pollution of our groundwater will take many generations to be restored, if it will ever be restored. Our groundwater aquifers might be polluted forever, perhaps with forever chemicals. Next slide, please. And when perennial chalk streams dry out unnaturally, there is ecological harm. And these impacts, the missing water, the polluted unseen aquifers and the dead wildlife, might be responsible for outpourings of ecological grief and feelings of solastalgia, which can be summarized as a feeling of nostalgia and melancholy for something that's missing. Perhaps it's been damaged or is gone forever. And these are things I intend to study through my research. Next slide, please. And people are self-aware enough to understand that our chalk streams are a source of well-being and cultural ecosystem services, and that if they're damaged, that we might be losing those benefits and harming those values. Next slide, please. A sense of place is one example. In southern England, there are lots of small lanes called water lane, especially in the headwaters of our chalk streams, sometimes in the pits of chalk streams that almost never flow, right at the top of our winterbournes. And somebody here is stuck the word no instead in front of water lane. Next slide, please. Many of our towns have grown up around these winterbournes. So the town of Chesham is based at the source, the winterbourne source of the River Chess even. And so society's identity, the actual identity of the town itself, is very closely linked to that winterbourne. Next slide, please. And it affects individuals at a very personal level too. There's somebody here saying, I want my river flowing. So perhaps the loss of water is affecting not only a social sense of place, but perhaps an individual personal identity too. Next slide, please. And returning to Swallowhead Springs, don't forget that's a natural aquifer-fed spring. So not surprisingly, it sometimes dries up. Next slide, please. So how do those people who might pilgrimage and to carry out pagan rituals and things at Swallowhead Springs, how do they feel when it's dry? Well, there's quotes of people who have traveled a long way who felt that the lack of energy, the lack of water did negatively affect their experience. Of course, the water's still there, it's just beneath their feet in the aquifer, and it's not there for natural reasons. There's no abstraction here causing it to dry out. But those people still felt a negative vibe from the absence of water. So one would surmise that it's actually the presence of surface water that's important for them. I don't know, but I am going to ask them. Next slide, please. And recreation and ecotourism are very, very important cultural ecosystem services. And they're commonly studied because one can quantify income, the monetary value of recreation and ecotourism, for example. Suka, could you run through about 4 slides here, just a few seconds apart, please? And many of our dry rivers are a source of recreation and ecotourism. Walking, horse riding, even playing sports, for example, across the world. And next slide, please. And perhaps can be a source of calmness and tranquility. Next slide, please. But not here in the UK. In the UK, we're really not that interested in temporary chalk streams when it comes to recreation. I cannot find a single slide anywhere on the internet of anyone standing in a dry winterbourne doing anything about it, enjoying it, even people unhappy about it. So natural winterbournes, when they're dry, do not appear to serve any function or for society or for individuals. However, here's a bunch of people standing in a dry chalk stream. It should be a perennial chalk stream, and so they're standing in it to make a point. And you might be able to make out some of the posters there. There's one, RIP, rest in peace. And so they are upset about the dry state of their perennial chalk stream. But as I say, there's really no interest in our naturally dry winterbournes. Next slide, please. So that's a real quick run through of the research I hope to conduct into how, or our relationship between society and individuals and our intermittent, our temporary streams. I don't have time to thank everybody involved in my research today. I am only just embarked upon it recently, so I am keen to receive people's ideas and notions about how that research might be shaped. But thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim. That was really great. We do have a little bit of time for questions. We're going to push the start of our break back to 11:05, but after that, we're going to be back on the schedule starting again at, I believe, 11:15. I just want to say that I think between hearing Tim's talk and Obi's, I think it's really important for California, at least, to really think more about the cultural and social perceptions of our aquatic resources, including ephemeral and intermittent streams. And maybe this is an area that we're lagging behind our colleagues in the UK, and we can really learn a lot from them. I think folks like Obi are really taking major strides forward with his work. I want to ask our team from the UK. We've got a number of questions in our Slack channel, but I just wanted to start and ask them, here you are speaking to, the vast majority of the bioassessment community in California. Given the chance to talk to this audience, what do you want them to know about the challenges with either studying or managing temporary rivers that you think, your experiences in the UK, what can you impart for us that we should be learning from? And I'll open it up to any of our panel members.
I think it's just such a great opportunity we're at such an early stage that even just our few sentences that we've just exchanged in the Slack channel, Rafi, are indicating that we can really learn from one another in terms of, I'm suggesting maybe carabid beetles could be useful for assessing geomorphological quality, and you're suggesting that spiders are a priority group. And Chloe, I'm not sure if you've got any initial insights, or if, yes, you've processed and identified your samples. But Rafi, yes, we need to work out, yes, which aspects of quality might these organisms be responding to. We need to try and work together to define the highest potential groups that we can prioritize.
Yeah, I mean, well, I have identified some sort of preliminary observations with spiders, and definitely sediment composition seems to be something they do respond to. And also sediment moisture and land use also seems to be quite an obvious response that they seem to make as well. So hopefully, yeah, once I get my analysis completed, I'll be able to tell you more.
Judy, Tim, do we have any management insights?
I can start there. I'll just say from a management point of view, how valuable it is working alongside research scientists. As managers, we collect a wealth of information, loads and loads of data, and we have metrics and tools, and we do our routine analysis of it. But by working with academics, it just opens it up to so much more interpretation and understanding, that our data can add so much more value in helping us understand and manage the system. But understanding, so as Tim says, we can sort of manage people's expectations that some rivers do naturally dry, and it's not always because of there's abstraction. Been talking to Tim, in sort of some areas up where I am, every single dry channel is a result of abstraction. But you go elsewhere in the country and everybody recognises a winterbourne and says they're wonderful. So it's very insightful. I'm very much looking forward to Tim's research.
And just also the opportunities to collaborate across organisations. So our collaboration with the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology in the UK has brought together the people who know about the life forms, the people who have been going out for years taking hydrological observations, the people who have done the initial analyses of those hydrological observations. So I think that there's just such an appetite, isn't there, for me as an academic to work with managers so that our research can have impact, and for you to ensure that your actions are evidence informed. So yes, it's bonkers that the dry phase is so poorly known in the UK, that we are literally the first people to do quantitative surveys of some of these biotic groups. Shuka's laughing at me, probably because that means we're so far behind. But yes, we also look forward to learning more from the research coming out in the US.
I've got time for maybe like one more question. I'm going to ask something that was brought up in the Slack channel from Nick Morgarano, and he just had general questions about the way that you can work with community scientists and support some of their needs, particularly with respect to quality assurance and data management. And I know, Tim, maybe you can expand on some of the comments you made on the Slack channel to Nick.
Yeah, well, I'm not an expert on it. I have participated in citizen science projects, and I think that one has to hook them early, and that there will be a large proportion of fallout from the initial group of volunteers. But those that you are hooked need to be receive proper training. We need to invest in their training in order to facilitate, enable them. And very quickly, some will become very expert if given the opportunity. But then the trick is to keep them interested. I think lots of citizen science projects have failed in the past because people feel remote from any data interpretation or implementation. So they might well be invaluable in collecting data, but if they're not involved or if they receive no feedback for what it's worth, how it's being used, then there's only so long you can sustain an interest. And so I think certainly in the Watercress and Winterbourne's project, we aim to provide constant feedback. Well, I think we will have group meetings and things, so people won't just mail it in and then be left alone. I think people will be involved to get together socially, if possible, in the current climate, in order to kind of form a team. I think that's how we intend to try and do it. It is a fact, I think, that sometimes some of the data is variable in quality, and I think one needs to invest in the best people and take it from there. The fact is that even amongst professionals, there's a lot of variability, and the way that we as an organisation in the Environment Agency, there is variability between different people visiting the same sites to take samples. So, we have to live with that. So I don't see that as a reason not to do it. It's all about how we set it up and the support we give these citizens.
Can I just add to that? Don't forget the importance of citizen science in engaging with people and educating them and helping them understand the river systems, and that is invaluable in itself.
All right, thank you, Judy. I want to thank our entire team. I want to thank Chloe and Kieran and Rachel and all of you for spending some time with us this morning or your afternoon. I think right now we are at a time where we're taking a break, and we'll be starting again at 11:15. I don't know if the conversation is continuing on the Slack channel as long as our friends in the UK can stay on. So please, I encourage everyone to continue engagement over there. So thank you very
so
much.
Rafi.
Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you, Shuka, as well.
Hey, David.
Hey, Pete, how's it going?
Great. Good to see you. So you're in Switzerland?
Yes, I am.
That's exciting. I like your tie.
Thank you. I'm still wearing sweatpants, but
Good for you. Good for you.
how have you been doing?
Oh, good as can be expected.
Hey guys,
Yeah.
just want to remind you that this is, I think, being webcast.
Thanks, Ravi.
All right, welcome back, everyone. Hope you enjoyed that quick break. So we're going to jump into the second session, which is moderated by Pete Odie with Department of Fish and Wildlife. And we'll hear a little bit about eelgrass and estuaries bioassessment monitoring down in SoCal through the Stormwater Monitoring Coalition. And then lastly, we'll hear a bit about protection and restoration tools that will help us prioritize our efforts. And before I hand it off to you, Pete, I'm going to quickly introduce you. So Pete oversees the Department of Fish and Wildlife's Aquatic Bioassessment Lab. And Pete's been there since 1995. Since 2005, he's also worked as the lead scientist for the California Water Board's Swamp Bioassessment Program. And Pete's primary focus is on developing the technical tools that we need for bioassessment and for helping California's resource agencies, like the State Water Board, adopt the use of ecological indicators in our programs. So Pete, handing it off to you.
Great. Thanks, Allie. And thanks to you and Shuka for coordinating all this. It's been great so far. Also, special thanks to Rafi and to Rachel for coordinating that great session. That was really fun to listen to. So hello to everybody. It's a pleasure to be back for our first ever virtual CABW meeting. I wish I could see you all in person, but this will do. All of the speakers in this session should be familiar faces to many of you if you've participated in CABW before. So I look forward to these. I'll get started with our first speaker. David Gillette is joining us from Switzerland. He and his co-presenter, Kenny McCune, we're going to be speaking on some work they've been doing on bioassessment in eelgrasses. David's a senior ecologist with the Southern California Coastal Water Research Project. He specializes in studying the influence of anthropogenic disturbances and habitat quality on structure and function of marine, estuarine, and freshwater biotic communities. Kenny McCune is a research technician at SCORP who works mostly on management and analysis of monitoring program data. Their presentation is titled A Conceptual Framework and Sampling Methodology for Bioassessment in Eelgrass Beds in California's Estuaries. David, thanks for joining us. I believe you have the controls, so begin whenever you're ready.
Okay, actually, I told Shuka I'd rather have her do it, given the lag issues, and I'm even further east than the folks in the UK, so it'll be even more of a lag. But thanks, Pete. Yeah, today I wanted to talk to you guys a little bit about some work that ourselves at SCORP and Cal State Long Beach have been doing to kickstart a how do you do bioassessment in estuaries and in eelgrass beds, specifically in estuaries. Next slide, please. Okay, so just a quick outline of what I'm going to be talking about today. First, I want to do a quick catch everyone up on sort of what we do for bioassessment in California's estuaries, and then the challenges that are presented by habitat engineers that we tend to find in these estuaries. Then I want to lay out sort of our new 3-tiered assessment framework we've developed for submerged aquatic vegetation. Then the last 2 pieces, I want to talk to you a little bit about some actual methods we've been developing for the 3rd tier of our framework and how we field tested some of those methods. And then lastly, some recommendations that came out of our report and out of our technical advisory committee. Next slide, please. So just to start you off, in case my web connection crashes or your web connection crashes, I want to talk. So these are sort of the summary and conclusions we came from our study. And I want to make sure as I go through them that if you guys if that makes sense to you as we walk through some of the results that we go through in our study. First, we've developed a robust SAV assessment framework that addresses both the extent, condition, and function of eelgrass beds. In that process, we developed 19 different indicators of eelgrass function that were then linked to 7 different priority eelgrass functions. We've developed standardized methods for data collection for each one of those indicators. Of those indicators, shoot density, percent cover, above ground biomass, and below ground biomass, those were the most responsive indicators of the suite that we measured. They were most responsive to stress. And lastly, bed-to-bed patterns of indicators were similar across seasons, winter, summer, and fall, with the magnitude of the indicators actually being greatest in the winter. All right, next slide, please. So now if I go down, you guys know this, you guys know the short shot of what we got out of this. So a quick blurb about bioassessment in California's estuaries. This is a very different habitat than most of the talks you'll see today. But estuaries and embayments, they're a conspicuous part of the coastline, and they support a variety of different aquatic life beneficial uses. Areas of special biological significance, commercial and sport fishing, estuarine habitat, preservation of rare species, shellfish harvesting, and fish spawning, amongst others. The important thing is that they're not uniform habitats. You get onto an estuary, you look out on an embayment, and that's all water. But they're not a uniform habitat. They're actually a mosaic of unvegetated sediments, sands and muds, hash, shellfish reefs, and submerged aquatic vegetation. Now, we have a good suite of tools to allow us to do some bioassessment in the unvegetated portion, sort of in those mud and sandy parts. And those were tools that were developed under the state's sediment quality objectives program. And those infer the condition of the habitat based upon the composition of the macrobenthic infaunal community that lives in those sites. However, we lack tools for the other parts of the habitat. Specifically, we lack tools for the vegetated habitats. Next slide. And vegetated habitats present a problem because they're really what we call habitat engineers. Next slide. So habitat engineers are flora and fauna that are both a biological resource, so like a typical sort of bioassessment that we think about every day in this meeting, but they're also unique because they create habitats that are different than the bare sediments around them that other biota are dependent upon. So they have this dual nature. Seagrasses, or submerged aquatic vegetation, SAV to the more technical term, they're the most conspicuous example of habitat engineers in California's estuaries and embayments. They're extensive throughout the shallow, sheltered waters from north to south. They're key primary producers that influence geochemical cycling from local pH balance of water, carbon sequestration, nitrogen cycling, denitrification, the whole 9 yards. And they're an important habitat and spawning ground for many different types of nekton and demersal fauna, so crustaceans, nekton, reptiles, etc. There are a number of varieties, species, of SAV one would find in California saline waters. You'll see Zostra marina, Zostra japonica, Zostra pacifica, and Rupia maritima in the estuaries proper. And then you'll see things like surfgrass, Phyllospadix, scalari in the nearshore coastal environment. Next slide. Next slide, please. Thank you. So, back one, please. Thank you. Cool. So there's a challenge when you talk about these habitat engineers. So most traditional bioassessment frameworks, they only really think of the flora or the fauna of a system as the biological resource. And it's the health and integrity of that biological resource that's used to infer the condition of the habitat that they live in. With habitat engineers, we typically, when we do monitor them, but we typically monitor them via sort of a mapping or an extent exercise, or like an example was kelp forest. So the amount of kelp that one sees in an aerial photograph is used to infer the amount of habitat that provides for fishes, abalone, et cetera, things along those lines. However, neither this traditional bioassessment approach nor the sort of mapping of habitat really addresses the dual nature of these types of habitat engineering organisms. For instance, the presence of an SAV bed, i.e. treating it as habitat, does not necessarily provide much insight into the health of that embayment where that grass is found. Conversely, the health of the plants in the SAV bed, i.e. treating it as a resource, doesn't provide much insight into the actual utility of that bed as habitat to other fauna. So that sort of led us down the road, okay, well, how do we wrap our arms around this particularly slippery plant? Next slide, please. And so that's where we thought we got to thinking. It's like, we've created a new sort of from scratch, a new 3-tiered assessment framework for SAV. Next slide, please. So we set about developing an approach that assesses the condition of SAV beds that incorporates both their dual nature as resource and habitat. So that's the sort of the new wrinkle. And we wanted to build a framework that can be applied to other species of SAV in different habitats. Like I said, I rattled off, there are 6 different species of SAV one typically finds in the coastal waters of California. So we wanted to develop a framework that in broad strokes could be applied to each one of those. We wanted to maintain a consistency of principles for each species amongst 3 different tiers. But we also wanted to allow for flexibility of component metrics or thresholds, things like that, between different species and potentially different ecosystems, because you have the same type of organism in an estuary and in an offshore situation. You're going to want to have different thresholds potentially for those. And the 3 tiers, so tier 1 is extent of SAV beds, tier 2 is the actual health of the SAV beds, and tier 3 is the ecological function of the SAV beds. And these tiers are intended, they don't have to, but they're intended to be done in sort of a sequential order. This provides a complete picture of the ecological integrity and the potential beneficial uses provided by these habitat engineering organisms. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. So tier 1 first, back up one, please. Thank you. There's a lag, I think, between me talking and the slides game. So tier 1, this is the extent piece. This is treating SAV as habitat. So the questions to be answered with this first extent are, where should SAV be present in the absence of perturbation? Where should it actually be? And is SAV present where it should be? So this is sort of how you do that first level of evaluation. Our technical approach, we think, for this tier 1 is to develop a spatially explicit habitat occupancy model for SAV, so where we can predict which parts of the coastal habitats, which species of SAV should be growing there. And then we can marry that with traditional mapping approaches where we can gather presence-absence information and compare that against the model, and it lets us know where grass should be, and if it's not there, why is it not there? And from an applicability standpoint, this is going to have a high degree of species specificity. These types of habitat occupancy models, they're going to be pretty specific to a given species. And there's potential need for different ecosystem specificity. The model for an estuarine system might be different than a model for an offshore system. Next one. So then tier 2, this is the health and integrity tier. This is thinking of SAV as a resource. And the questions to be answered here are sort of more of the traditional bioassessment questions. If there's SAV present in a system, how healthy is it? And does the health of that SAV, what does that tell you about the condition of the water body where those plants are found? The technical approach here, again, should sound familiar to you guys, is to develop a series of stressor response relationships between bed or individual plant characteristics and the potential stressors present in that water body. We can then quantify, integrate, and calibrate those stressor response relationships into a condition assessment index that allows us to get us the health of the water body where the grasses are present. And applicability here, so the types of responses, they're probably going to be consistent amongst different species of SAV, but the actual thresholds or the sort of the way that the different integrators are integrated together, condition threshold, that's going to vary probably by species and by ecosystem. Next slide, please. The third and final tier is ecosystem function. And this is treating SAV both as habitat, some of this is the habitat stuff, some of this is resource stuff. And the question we're trying to answer with this tier is, if SAV is present, are the beds providing the ecosystem functions that they would be expected to? This is the ultimate sort of achievement of the beneficial uses one would expect from this type of organism. The technical approach here is to identify a series of key ecological functions, ecosystem services, and beneficial uses that SAV beds should be providing to the coastal zone, identify structural measures that can be used as indicators of that function, and then benchmark ecosystem functions to those indicators in a series of validation exercises. The applicability here is the types of functions, they're going to probably be consistent across different species of SAV, but the expected magnitude of those functions, those will probably vary from species to species. All right, next slide. So we have a 3-tiered framework that we were pretty comfortable with. So then we went to start getting actually making this real, developing methods for our third, and we started with our 3rd tier. So next slide. Before I get too much into the rubs, I'm going to take a step back and sort of talk a little bit about sort of what we see as the timeline of building a bioassessment program de novo. This is starting from scratch. So the first is you have to develop a conceptual framework. Second, you want to develop field methodology. Then you're going to need to validate the efficacy of that methodology. Does it actually work? Is it practical? Create a data set that incorporates spatial and temporal variability using all those methods. Then build an assessment tool from the data set of those data you collected. And finally, validate the performance of those assessment tools. Next slide. And so I just laid out our conceptual framework. So the next couple slides I'm going to spend talking to you about our development of the field methodology and our beginning efforts to validate the efficacy of said methodology. Next slide. All right, so our approach to doing all this. We want to start with estuarine Zostra marina eelgrass. That was our starting point. It's the most common and well-studied type of SAV in the state's saline waters, and it's a key part of the estuarine habitat mosaic that we don't assess well, as I mentioned earlier. And we started developing methodology for our third tier of our framework because that honestly had the greatest amount of interest from the regional boards. And also it provides that looking at function provides the tightest coupling between bioassessment collection and the actual evaluation of beneficial uses that are assigned with a given water body. The way we set about doing this was we worked with a team of eelgrass experts. It wasn't just us at Scorp in Long Beach saying, thou shalt do X, Y, and Z. But we wanted to work with eelgrass experts from around Southern California. We set about with them to identify key functions, key structural metrics, and the best way to collect those data. Once we had all that down from our expert panel, then we went and field tested those methods to determine if those techniques actually work best. Next. All right, so let's begin with the key eelgrass functions that were identified. Based on our literature review and our expert panel, we identified these series of key ecological functions and ecosystem services that eelgrass beds provide compared to bare sediment. First is carbon sequestration, then fish habitat provision, increased primary production, increased secondary production, substrate stabilization, water quality improvement, and lastly, waterfowl habitat provision. So these are the key functions we are trying to identify structural metrics around to quantify. Next slide, please. So how do we go about doing that? So you could theoretically go out and measure each one of those functions at all kinds of beds, but that's not a super practical thing to do, we think, in a regular monitoring context. So we set about doing this. We created what we're calling our SAV indicator applicability matrix. And that's what we have here on the right-hand side. We asked the question to our expert panel, what structural measures of flora and fauna serve as proxies for those key functions? And those are the little intersections. And we asked them to rate the applicability of each indicator, each metric to each function between high, medium, low, or none. So high in the green, medium in the yellow, low in the red, none is blank. And then from each one of those indicators, we asked them to identify what's the best methods for measuring each one of those. And we had either a group consensus on, yes, this is the best method, or there was some, they gave us a couple options they wanted us to test out in the field. Next slide. All right, so now we're getting to the actual field testing of the methods. I'm going to move a little quickly because I only have 4 minutes left. Next slide. So our basic survey approach, this is a diver-based transect type of approach where we do transects and quadrat counting, looking at both like above ground and below ground biomass for different types of eelgrass. Next slide, please. And we need to test the practicality and the efficacy of these, measuring each metric in sort of the context of a monitoring program. So we collected data for each metric at multiple beds during different seasons, fall, winter, and summer. The beds in these beds were exposed to different levels of stress, and the beds comprise different what we call bed typologies, different sizes, and whether it's a perennial bed or an ephemeral bed. And we collected them in Newport Bay, so we had 6 beds in Newport Bay in the top and 2 beds in San Diego Bay in the lower picture. And from our panel, they didn't come back to us consensus methods for everything. So a couple of the metrics, percent cover, sheet height, and sheet density, they gave us a couple options, which basically broke down to a field versus a lab-based approach, and told us just test out both and see what the answer is. So we'll go to our next slide. So just to give you a quick taste of some of the results we saw. So these are most of our 3 minutes. Okay, moving quickly. These are all from Newport Bay eelgrass beds. What we saw was relatively similar bed-to-bed patterns between seasons. So we have summer at the top and winter at the bottom. And there was some response to our nominal stressor gradient. So less stressed beds on the left, more stressed beds on the right. And we saw a greater magnitude of many of the metrics in the winter versus the summer, which is kind of interesting because summer is the max growth, but winter is kind of the senescence. That was sort of the opposite of what we expected. Next slide. This was just a quick comparison of our different field versus lab methods. And the upshot is that for field sheet density, we found that the lab-based methodology gave you the field-based methodology gave you greater variance, greater detail on the lower density beds. And then for sheet height and for percent cover, we recommended doing field-based methodologies. Okay, next slide. Sorry, I just want to move through these. Oh, I thought I had another slide in there. I have plenty of time. So just to review sort of our summaries and conclusions. We have a robust SAV assessment framework, that 3-tier framework we talked about that addresses extent, condition, and habitat function, and addresses that dual nature of these habitat engineering organisms. We came up with 19 different indicators, and we linked those to the 7 priority eelgrass functions. We have standardized methods now, and that of those standardized indicators, sheet density, cover, above ground biomass, and below ground biomass, those were the most responsive indicators to stress. And our bed-to-bed patterns and the indicators, those were similar across seasons, but with the greatest magnitude of those being in the winter. Next slide, please. So some recommendations that came out of our panel and out of our results was, first, we need to start identifying opportunities to apply these methods. So we have a good set of methods we feel pretty solid about, but we need to start applying in the other regions of the state to generate a larger, temporally more spatially diverse data set through the Southern California Bite program, to the Estuarine NPA monitoring program, other potential programs. So if there's interest in trying to apply these methods elsewhere. Second is we made the recommendation we should be using the field-based methods for the sheet density and percent cover, and use lab-based methods for our shoot height. Those were the ones that we didn't get good group consensus on initially. We want to continue to validate the structure-function relationship. So right now, you notice we're using structure metrics as proxies for functional behavior. And presently, we're validating carbon sequestration and carbon stabilization functions. And then our last recommendation is we should set about developing the tier 1, the extent piece, and tier 2, the water body condition methods and tools. Next slide. All right, so this is work that both Kenny and I did. So Kenny's actually on the phone here too, so he can chime in if he needs to. And if we have a full report on this with a lot more gory details about the methodology and the results and things like that, which is available on the SCORP website, or if you ping me, I can easily send you a copy. So with that, I'll wrap it up.
Great, thanks, David. That was great. So I got a question. I got one question came in from Rafi, of course, that he actually directed at Ali and me, but I'm going to give it back to you. So let me read his question.
I'll pass the buck, I see.
Yeah. So he said, given that we only focus on a small number of aquatic habitats in California for our monitoring programs, it's a resource limitation issue, right? How do we decide which habitats need a set of bioassessment tools, and how do we prioritize them? So I guess the question, I would reframe that, or maybe an element of that to you, is how ready do you think the management community is for using these tools? And what's your take on Rafi's question?
So I think the management community, certainly in the South that I've spoken to, they're all champion at the bit to do this sort of thing. So the regional board, I won't name them, but some of the regional boards in the South and Wetlands Monitoring Council, things along those lines, but they're very excited that they're starting to see, because again, this is something that lots of people study in sort of very isolated instances, but if we can develop a consistent methodology across the board, people are really excited about that. And like I said, there's a lot of sort of snowball down the hill momentum on getting this put into the BITE program and some other regional monitoring programs, which I really think if we can get a foothold there, it's good to go. But in terms of prioritization of what water bodies get studied, I think there is certainly, because there's certainly an extent question, is like what is the biggest water bodies? And I think there is, secondly, beyond that, what is the value is a horrible word, but sort of that ecosystem services, societal value, and sort of we have to prioritize what the default answer should be all water bodies should be assessed in some fashion eventually. But in terms of how do you start ranking them, I think it has to do first with extent and size, and then secondarily, what has that economic, societal, and ecological value.
Great, thanks. It's a big question, obviously, and it's one we spend a lot of time thinking about in our program. How do we allocate a really small amount of resources that we have available? So, and the questions we talked about this morning, or that I think it came up a number of times about societal value isn't just a static thing, right? How we value resources changes over time, right? So as we make people more and more aware of the value of different things, that's part of the job is changing the way society values things. So anyway, thank you for that. I am going to keep us on track by sending it back to Rafi. People want to continue to ask questions of.
Yeah, Kenny and I are still on here, and Kenny and I are both on the Slack. So if you have any sort of technical stuff, he may be able to chime in, or if any sort of bigger picture questions, I may be able to chime in. So thank you all for your time.
Great, thanks, David. Okay, our next speaker is Rafi Mazur. You may remember him as the moderator of our previous session. Rafi is a principal scientist at SQUIRP, same place David works. He's been there since, well, for what, 13, 14 years now. And during that time, Rafi has become a major influencer in the field of bioassessment in California and around the world now. So we're thrilled to have him in that role and looking forward to seeing your talk, Rafi. Rafi is going to present a presentation entitled "A Regional Assessment of Trends in Stream Condition in Southern California." Begin whenever you're ready.
All right, thank you, Pete. And yeah, so I've been working with the bioassessment community in California for over a dozen years now. And one of the key areas where I was starting is helping the folks in Southern California kickstart their regional monitoring program with the Stormwater Monitoring Coalition. And so it's been a while. We've been collecting data for quite a while. I've presented to you guys before. And it's high time we start looking back and seeing what this data tells us about our region, in particular, how things have changed over the past 12 years. And so I'm going to share a little bit about what we've learned about our region and how we are starting to understand how conditions are changing in the region. So next slide. So the Stormwater Monitoring Coalition began in 2001. It was basically a collaborative group of some of the lead stormwater and regulatory agencies. The Southern California regional boards are members, the state board is a member, but also our flood control districts and public works districts. So you have both regulatory and regulated communities, as well as a handful of oddballs like SQUIRP and Department of Fish and Wildlife that are sort of in neither category. And in 2009, we began our regional stream survey. We did a 5-year cycle, and then we started another cycle in 2015. We're about to start our third cycle next year. The reason why we started is that we recognized that there was a lot of biomonitoring going on within the region, but we didn't really see, we didn't think it was very effective. We thought that there was a lot of resources being spent and not a lot of insights being gained, particularly when it comes to regional questions. Shukla, can you go back? Yeah, and so there was very little sharing of data and no interpretation of shared data among the different agencies working within the region. And that's really what drove the group to get started. There are two major sources of funding for the group. You've got the regulated community that contributes data that they collect that also fulfills their mandated permit monitoring. So that's one source. And then the regulators have been contributing to the program through their discretionary funding, mostly through small funding. So we have these two sources that really drive the program. Next slide. So the data, it forms a key part of a lot of our management programs. The SMC itself serves as the Southern California portion of the statewide perennial streams assessment. So it's really we provide the data to characterize a whole region. And the data is used in the integrated report, both the 303D and 305B listing of the condition of the state's water bodies. And what's great about this is that the reason why the Southern California agencies participate is that it ensures that Southern California conditions are really well represented in statewide science, like the indices we develop or thresholds that are set for those indices. Finally, the survey data creates a real strong foundation for doing causal assessment to fix the problems once you've identified them. And finally, gives us really the ability to do long-term assessments at a regional scale about how all our monitoring programs are working. Next slide. So like I mentioned, we began our program in 2009, and we focused on 3 primary questions. And these 3 questions really continue to be the driving force of the program, although we've refined them a bit over the years. The first question is, what is the biological condition of streams in Southern California? That is, what's the extent of healthy streams or streams in poor condition? And when we have streams in poor condition, what are the stressors that are associated with it? Are these high levels of nutrients or contaminants or habitat degradation? You go back one, or sorry. Yeah. Shuk, I think you might have it advancing automatically. Shuk, can you back up? Okay. And it's a third question that's really going to be the focus of my talk today, and that is how are conditions changing over time? All right, okay, can we go forward one? All right, so we've built a really large data set that gives us a pretty good idea of where our healthy and unhealthy streams are located. It's really pretty clear at this point that every watershed manager in the region has some really healthy streams in our undeveloped portions of our watersheds, but we also have a lot of degraded streams in our urban and coastal areas that are more developed. And so we all have these common problems that we need to work on together. Next slide. So we started looking at trends a little bit more closely, and what I'm showing you here is an excerpt of data that Andy Wren presented in the statewide assessment of streams in the last PSA report. And what you see is that there's not really a big change in the condition of streams over time. Maybe there's a little bit of a decline, but it's nothing really major. The extent of healthy and unhealthy streams has been relatively constant over the years. Can you go to the next slide? But really, what does that mean? So what I've got here are sort of 3 little cartoons showing, stable conditions over time. That's time on the x-axis, condition on the y-axis. And there's different ways you can get this. Can you click? You might have true stability where most of the sites in your region are in fact themselves stable. And so you don't see trends in the region because you don't have trends at the sites. Next slide. But you could also have sort of a net balance, improving and degrading streams canceling each other's out, leading to very large changes at certain sites, but not much change in the regional condition. And finally, the third one, if you could click, there's the, sort of this chaos of like, widespread variability, and all the sites are changing in fairly unpredictable directions. These all look the same when you look at a regional condition. So how do you tell them apart? Click. Well, the SMC has really started increasing the amount of site revisits to help really figure out which of these three scenarios are at play, because the way you'd want to manage them in response is quite different. Okay, can you click? Okay, so since 2014, the SMC has begun revisiting probabilistic sites and collecting data to really try to get better assessments of trends. We focus on a set of developed probabilistic sites and those with undeveloped watersheds. And we've been visiting them pretty much yearly since 2014. The plan is to get the same sites visited many times, although we'll switch that up if that site becomes unavailable for some reason or another. Once we've done that, our effort was to classify sites classify trends within each site. Are they degrading? Are they improving? Are they stable? And then you can extrapolate across the region to know what extent of the region is in which class. And we were able to include a lot of what I call serendipitous trend sites. These are sites that are sampled under other programs under a routine basis, but because they fall near a probabilistic site, we were able to just use them in our probabilistic assessments. Okay, next slide. We actually got quite a good data set this way. We have almost 200 sites across the region with some level of replication. About a third of them, we have at least two different sampling of, more than two sampling events, so 3 or more years of sampling. And the typical site has a span of years of about 6 years. So we've got, I would say a growing long-term data set here in Southern California. Next slide. Well, how do we classify the sites? Well, we looked at a few different factors. First of all, we decided that if you only had 2 different sampling events, that wasn't really enough to tell whether a site was truly changing or not. And so we really, only focused on the 60 sites with 3+ years of data. We looked at 2 things. We calculated the range of scores, the minimum and the maximum over that course, regardless of what time they occurred. We also did a linear regression predicting CSCI scores as a function of year. This is a really simple linear model. And based on that, we made our classifications. If there was a significant positive slope, we classified the site as increasing scores. If there's a significant negative slope, we said it was decreasing. And then if it wasn't a significant slope, we said it was stable if the overall range was less than the range we expect from natural variability based on reference sites. And if it was a larger range, we said it wasn't determinate. This is basically akin to that chaos model that I showed you. So we have balancing change, true stability, and chaos sort of arising from these different types of classifications. Next slide, please. So we actually ended up seeing evidence of all 3 scenarios, but it looks like, in my view at least, that stability is one of the more common phenomena that we're seeing. What you see on this graph on the right, these are stacked bar charts showing the proportion of sites in different land use classes. And the ones that I could classify are shown in colors, and that white space on the top are those that I couldn't classify. So these are sort of the ones where the change was too dramatic to really figure out what was going on. It was too unpredictable. And across land use types, whenever I could make a classification, stability was by far the most common scenario. And a small number of sites were increasing or decreasing, but in roughly equal numbers. So they are balancing each other out. You could look at this graph and say, okay, urban sites are improving, agricultural sites are decreasing, but we're really talking about just 1 or 2 sites in each class. So I really wouldn't go too far in generalizing to those land uses at this time. Could you go to the next slide? So what is going on at those changing sites? And unfortunately, I don't have a great answer for you guys at this time. There isn't really an obvious pattern to where they fall in the landscape. They really occur across the region, so not like one specific kind of land use where you see improvements or degradation or stability. So I think really what's more likely happening is that you have site-specific changes in environmental conditions leading to site-specific changes in biological condition. You might have things like wildfire or changes in water use practices leading to these changes. It's also possible, like given the statistical nature of the approach I'm using, that you could be seeing spurious changes or regression to the mean. Regression to the mean is basically saying, you know, if your first time you sample, you happen to get a very high score, you're bound to see a decrease when you resample that site. And conversely, if your first sampling event is at a low score, you're bound to see an improvement over time, even if the site's not truly changing. As our sampling record increases, the likelihood of that spuriousness is going to gradually diminish. Next slide. So this is just an example of some of the specific changes at sites that we observed. And there's a lot of different things that we see going on. We have, for example, in that second panel, a stream that is, the score is gradually decreasing, but it still hasn't quite crossed that threshold between what we consider to be intact and unaltered. But so far it still is in good conditions. Whereas in other cases, you see improvements approaching that line, like in that bottom left panel. In some cases, we're dealing with sites that span almost 20 years of data. And so it's possible that conditions have changed quite dramatically since the first sampling event. We haven't really figured out what's going on in each of these specific sites, but we are using this to prioritize which kinds of sites we want to go back to and do some additional investigations. Next slide. So I want to be the first to admit that the approach we used to classifying was pretty crude. It's a really good first cut, but by no means is it the only way to identify trends at these sites. The approach I used was based on a linear model, which is represented by that green line in that sort of diagram I'm showing you here. And it is probable that changes we are observing are nonlinear or some other form. Like, for example, you could have step changes where there's an abrupt change in condition followed by stability. And our modeling approach isn't really ideal for detecting those types of changes. And so we really do need to explore other types of statistical approaches for classifying these sites. More importantly, once we've classified these sites, we really want to associate them with actually two different things. First, we want to know, are there environmental changes we can associate with these changes in condition? Like, are there factors that lead to improving or degrading sites? And are there certain site characteristics that make certain streams more liable to change, or more stable and more resistant to change? Next slide. So what's next for our program? Well, we're actively discussing and designing the next 5 years, are putting together a work plan. We've got consensus that we've got a really good handle on some of those questions that we were set out to answer. And so we are going to be cutting back on the amount of probabilistic sites that we sample. We're not dropping them entirely, but we'll be reducing, and we will reallocate that resource to other priorities. These priorities are still being figured out, but they include an enhancement of trend sampling, where we're basically trying to increase the number of sites that we can classify. But we're also looking at a number of special studies, such as improving causal assessment, or in fact, trying to do some more wet-dry mapping to figure out, which streams we have are perennial or non-perennial or ephemeral. And this is driven heavily by the proposed biological objectives in San Diego, which will apply to perennial and, quote, seasonal streams. So we want to know which streams we've been assessing fall into those categories. Go to my last slide. I just want to reemphasize that what is the vision of the SMC and the way it views its survey being used in the future. We hope to have comprehensive assessment of our aquatic resources, whether it's streams or moving to other water body types like David mentioned. We want to make sure our data is available and relevant to the key management decisions. And ultimately, we want to see the survey being used as the sort of final word how effective all of our multiple watershed management programs are being. So it's really the final assessment tool. And with that, I'll end it up, close out, and if there's any time for questions, I'll take them.
Thank you, Rafi. That's great. I have one question while we're waiting for stuff to come in on Slack. So how does your treatment, or how does our treatment of trends change when we work in non-perennial streams? Do you think, these are habitats where it may be harder to distinguish trends in the things that we're interested in from, say, natural disturbance?
So I think what you'll find, and this actually relates to one of the questions that came in on Slack about the role of precipitation changes and climate changes. I think you'll find that the non-perennial streams and intermittent streams are probably better tuned into those changes than some of our perennial systems, particularly our perennial systems that are effluent dominated and largely cut off from these natural cycles and precipitation. Their flow kind of is constant regardless of drought or storms. So I think you'll see greater sensitivity in certain kinds of streams if we expand where we're looking.
Okay, thanks. We did get a couple questions came in. First one was from Jerry Diamond. How important is precipitation changes and other climate change factors in the trends you may or may not see?
Yeah, and so I think this is sort of what I was getting at earlier, in that when we looked at it's a little hard to answer because we see that the changes that we do observe are relatively site specific and not these regional phenomena. You know, those sites that are improving or degrading are experiencing the same climate conditions, and so there's probably some sort of complex interplay with how sensitive each site is to those conditions in combination with other types of changes in stress that they're experiencing.
Okay. And last one, we have a theme here. Rachel Stubbington asks, is it challenging to characterize reference communities due to their naturally high levels of variability and increasing variability driven by climate change?
This is a really good question. It's one that I hear coming up a lot is, you know, we have these tools that are calibrated for a set point in time and the climate is changing. Does that really constrain our ability to use them in the future? And I would say that the answer is, yeah, it is constraining. If reference conditions do change over time and climate change will be a part of that. And this is really, I would say, more speaking for the bioassessment program statewide rather than the SMC specifically. But this is why the bioassessment program has been sampling reference sites over time. And in particular, it started revisiting a set of reference sites that represent different parts of the region. So we can take a look back and say, are our tools still working, or do we need to recalibrate them? I don't know if you want to comment on that yourself, Pete. But.
Yeah, I think I'll keep us moving here, but yeah, obviously that one's near and dear to my heart, as is all of this stuff. So thank you for that great presentation. I'm sure Rafi is more than happy to participate in Slack and other venues for continuing the discussion. Okay, our final speaker in this session is another familiar face, Jerry Diamond. Jerry, welcome back.
Thank you.
Jerry is the director of ecotoxicology for Tetra Tech, and he's been working with the city of San Diego on sediment quality issues, bacteria, recreational water quality criteria, bioobjectives, and most recently, web-based analytical tools for screening causes of biological impairment and for supporting restoration and protection priorities, among many other things. Jerry's presentation is titled Restoration and Protection Prioritization Tool for Southern California Streams. Jerry, good to have you back. You can start whenever you're ready.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much, Pete. And it's great to be back, although not, I mean, virtually at least anyway. So I'd just like to recognize my co-authors, Vicki Kalkritz from San Diego and Clint Boshin from our San Diego office. I also want to acknowledge Ann Roseberry Lincoln and Eric Leppo, who did a lot of the work that you're really going to see here. So I can have the next slide, please. This should be interesting because I have a lot of animations. So go ahead and just do a few clicks here. So basically, the reason for this whole thing is because, as many of you know, there are many streams in Southern California that are either in fair or poor biological condition. And so which are the highest priority for restoration? And then likewise, you have unimpaired streams that may be vulnerable. And so which ones are highest priority for protection? And this has become, of course, this is important, not just in Southern California, but nationally, these are important questions. And the city in particular and other stakeholders, at least in Southern California, have been very interested in this and having tools to help them do that. And especially where you can provide multiple co-benefits. If I could have the next slide. So basically, we developed this with the city and other folks. Definitely Dave Gillette, Rafi Mazur, Eric Stein from SQUAREP, as well as Chad Laughlin from the regional board, helped a lot with many of the things that you're going to see here. So the restoration protection prioritization, the overview, you can see the goals here. We want to identify high priority sites for restoration protection. If you can click a few times here, you'll see this RPP tool consists of several different things. And it's, I'll go through this very quickly. One more click, that's it. CAST tool, which is this causal assessment screening tool, which I've talked about before at this conference now. That's included in this tool here. The SCAPE, that's the stream classification and priority explorer that SCORP developed, and that's included here as well as the biological condition gradient, the BCG. We also include a recovery potential kinds of concepts and methods that were in EPA's RPS tool. And then as user input, as well as I'll show you just a glimpse of the Shiny app, that's the web application, so that the users who don't know code can still use this whole thing. So it supports biological objectives and a lot of other things that I hope you'll see as we go through. I can have the next slide. So we built a foundation on many, many things that we and others have done in Southern California. You can keep clicking. There's a few more things. We've along with SCORP and other folks in Southern California, have been looking at many, many different tools to help us with interpreting biological objectives, but also all these other bioassessment related things. And a lot of this work, if you can click again, a lot of this work went into this CAST tool, this causal assessment screening tool, which again, folks I mentioned before, helped a lot with some of the foundation of that. And if you can go to the next slide. So in building this foundation, we have now these two different tools. They can be run independently, but the causal assessment screening tool came first, and now that's incorporated for those who want to use it into this recovery protection prioritization tool. Okay, so if I can have the next slide, I'm going to go more into the RPP tool because I've already talked before about the CAST tool, but I'll just summarize a few things on this CAST tool. I can have the next slide. So you can click a few times here. So basically, we're using pretty much the CADIS causal assessment framework that EPA had that we've worked with them on over many years. And we are using certain lines of evidence as part of the causal assessment framework for which we have data. We really have data at many sites. And I want to echo, by the way, what Rafi said in his talk, that we are fortunate in this region to have quite a lot of data to work with. Having worked in other states, it isn't always so nice. So we have data to use to look at different lines of evidence here. And what this CAST tool does is you're able to map your test site with the site you're interested in. And then it takes you automatically, really, through many steps to identify candidate causes based on comparisons with comparator sites, which is something that we've dealt a lot with Dave Gillette and the others at SCORP and as well as Chad Laughlin. And then we go through step 3 of analyzing the data, including some diagnostics that we developed for Southern California, particularly for high ionic strength or conductivity and fine sediment. And again, this is for the SMC region in Southern California. So we use a weight of evidence approach then to figure out likely causes. Okay, if I can have the next slide. So in the next slide, you can click that. So the RPP tool, basically the highlights of that is, again, it's modeled after EPA's recovery potential screening tool, but includes much more information that's Southern California specific. And it considers connectivity of the target reach that you're interested in to upstream and downstream reaches. So it gives you some context, along with the SCAPE tool, which also does some of that as well. And again, it interacts with the CAST tool. If I can have the next slide, please. And click a few times here. So the RPP score is based on the similar components here. We have potential, we have threats, opportunities, keep going. And each of those is on has a few indicators. Click 2 more times. So we have the potential, which I would consider, it's one of the most important. They're all important, But potential is talking about ecological lift. And that's what we're really interested in for restoration, particularly. And then threats, of course, comes into play with everything, particularly protection. And then opportunities is very important because that's really where you can maybe get co-benefits and so on. If I could have the next slide. Okay, so with potential, oh, all right, that's fine. With potential, we have greater ecological uplift, we figure, if the expected biological condition could be better than the observed condition. And I hope I'll give you an example of that in a couple of slides. So that includes the CSCI score, what it's doing now, SCAPE, which I mentioned earlier, and the biological condition gradient, which is incorporated into that. And then if you have lower stress or influence, well, that's probably a better bet for restoration and maybe protection as well. And so a lot of these will all go into this potential sub-index. Each of these is scored in a different way. Next slide. So that's the potential part of this. The threats is 2 indicators, land use change, which is pretty much looking at really some kinds of population growth, urban development, as well as fire hazard. And these are taken from various databases in particularly Southern California. And the next slide, we have opportunities, which is ecological and recreational co-benefits, which we're getting from different, again, different databases, including EnviroAtlas, EPA's EnviroAtlas, as well as user-defined co-benefits, which is pretty important because the user will know something that nobody else does. And if I can get to the next slide. So there's a way for the tool for the user to actually weight those opportunities even more. And this is just an example from SCAPE for a particular site where you have a distribution of potential CSCI scores based on its landscape context. If I can have the next slide. And say we have a site though that's scoring very poorly. So it's on a BCG tier 6 there. If you can click 2 more times. And 1 more. Okay, what this tool will recognize is that that particular reach has a much better chance of having uplift because according to SCAPE and the BCG, it has much better potential. So that might be one that's a very good candidate for restoration. I can have the next slide. So that takes care of some of the ecological uplift we're talking about. There's plenty more that goes into that. But the connectivity I just wanted to bring out as well, because it's very important that what's going on upstream of your reach. So in this case, the orange, if you can see that, those reaches are much better than the circle target reach. So in other words, if you restore that target reach, it has a good chance at least of having some better biology because of what's upstream of it. So again, the landscape context and what's going on there is important. Okay, if I can, next slide. And so the overall RPP score, and if you give it 2 or 3 clicks, is going to be basically much like what the EPA's tool is. It's going to be a basically an average or sum of these different indices, the potential, the threats, and the opportunity. And it averages those, and that's your RPP score. Okay, and again, all this is very spelled out actually in our user guide. I can have the next slide. And again, there's a lot of user flexibility. I won't go into this now, I don't have time, but basically there's a lot of places where the user has flexibility to weight things more or less, including potential threats and opportunities, or to add more things about opportunities if they know of such things. Next slide. And then I just want to very briefly talk about the interface here. This is the web app, if I could have the next slide. And that basically, again, here too, the idea is you have a map interface where the person can, the user can select their reach from the map. And by doing so, they can figure out, you know, what reach they want to look at. And there's lots of different ways. They can do it by COM ID. There's a lot of different ways that they can do this. And they can select their reach and they can blow it up. They can zoom in and so on. I can have the next slide. And once it goes through this, you'll get a report that looks something like this, where you have the site on the map on the left. It tells you about the reach, There's a lot more information that goes in here that you can also get. This one, it has a protection score of 0.703, which highest you can get is 1. 1 is the highest number. I can tell you from experience now, looking at almost every reach in this region, a 0.7 is a pretty high number. That's a pretty good score. And I point this one out because it actually has a CSCI score currently. If you look at that table that down below, its CSCI score is 0.78. It's just slightly below that 0.79 threshold. So it's one that would be, according to this tool and the analyses, a great candidate for protection, as well as maybe restoration, but more so for protection, because we don't want it to slip any further. So you're going to get what your different sub-indices do here in terms of potential threats and opportunities. And there's a lot more information that the user can download from this. If I could have the next slide. Okay, and there's a lot of potential applications for this. I'm not going to go through all this, but basically, water quality improvement plans, for example, many kinds of things that for example, the city of San Diego has to deal with, but lots of other users out there for sure will have to deal with. So there's a lot of ways, a lot of applications for these tools. So I know I went through this pretty quickly. Hopefully, maybe there'll be time for questions. If I have the next slide, I think that's just acknowledging again my folks. Oh, I have 3 minutes. Oh, can I go back? Well, anyway, I just want to say thank you. I kind of rushed through that. I thought I had less time. So I'm open for questions if anybody has them.
Great. Thank you, Jerry. A lot of good stuff there. So there aren't any questions coming yet, but as they come in, I do have one thing I'm curious to hear your thoughts on. We're fortunate, I think, to be living in a time where a lot of tools like these are starting to be developed. People are really on the management end are really interested in this, in how to use this information to make better decisions. And I guess I'm curious about your experience working with these tools in different contexts or working with different stakeholder groups, and things like citizen groups or developers, city managers versus state managers. Do competing interests champion different tools? Does that affect how these tools get used, that sort of thing?
Well, actually, it's a great question. I mean, in my experience working elsewhere, I would say these tools, things like this, are excellent vehicles for getting stakeholders to talk to each other and to maybe seek some common ground. I mean, I can think of a few examples where by, having an objective analytical way of going about this, I mean, we're not trying to, stack the deck of, then we can see, all right, well now, if this stakeholder thinks that, well, this particular area, this site, this reach is a higher priority because they know some things that they want to do there anyway, or for example, there may be socioeconomic reasons they want to do it, environmental justice or other reasons. And that may not, everybody may not agree with the rationale, but at least you can get it on the table. You can now say in a more transparent way, where they're coming from and why they like or don't like a certain prioritization or something like that.
Right. So maybe
for the city anyway, and I think many of their stakeholders, I think it looks as if this will be a very good, at least communication tool, if nothing else. But it should help really to get some on the ground improvements, hopefully.
Great, thanks for that. Another question just came in from Josh Westfall, who asks, does the application incorporate multiple biological samples? And if it doesn't, could it?
Yes, it does. I didn't get into that, but one of the lines of evidence is time series. So actually it feeds into what Rafi just talked about. Most of the sites that we had in this so far in this database had maybe 2 visits. But that is something that we have the analyses in there for, and it could take more. I mean, there's no limit right now on how many repeat visits and all. The other thing too, by the way, is the user can select the year range that they want to use for the analysis. So for example, we've already determined that most of the samples in the SMC region are between 2008 and 2015 or so, 2016 maybe. And there may be more and more coming, but that's what's in the database so far that we can grab. So a user has the flexibility to say, I don't want to look at anything before 2008, even if there are data out there. So that kind of thing. So there's a lot of flexibility to include more than one set of samples for a site.
Okay, great. Well, this is obviously a subject of, I think, just a ton of interest in a lot of different people. So another good candidate for further discussion on Slack. Thanks again, Jerry, for a great presentation. Thanks to everybody in the session for great talks. I really appreciate it. I guess it's back to you, Allie.
Cool. Thank you, Pete. Yeah, and thanks everyone for your engagement and participation so far in this morning session. We're going to break. It's 12:16, sorry, for lunch. And for those that are interested, please join the CalSFS business meeting. Head over to the agenda. There's a link there. You can join the Zoom meeting. The meeting information's there for you. And then after lunch at 1:15, that virtual poster session will start. 2:15 is the R workshop, and all of that information is in the agenda. So this concludes today's talks, and then we'll meet you all back tomorrow at 9 a.m. To pick up again. Thanks, everybody.